Get out. My chairs weren't built for a woman your size.
Your chairs have more backbone than you do.
Maeve Holloway, I've been looking for you.
If you came to laugh too, save your breath. Where do you expect me to sleep?
Right here. This house has room for you.
She dragged 100 pounds of tools through a blizzard, and every door in town slammed shut in her face. Keep reading to find out what happened when one man pulled back the blanket and said, "Right here." The stagecoach axle snapped at 3:30 in the afternoon, and it sounded like a rifle shot. Maeve Holloway heard it before she felt it, that sharp, metallic crack slicing through the howl of the wind, and then the whole left side of the coach dropped hard, sending her shoulder into the wooden wall, and her trunk sliding across the floor into her shins. The horses screamed. The driver cursed God by his full name, and the blizzard, indifferent as ever, kept right on coming. She was the only passenger. She pushed open the door and dropped down into the snow, and it swallowed her boots past the ankle. The cold hit her face like a slap from an open palm, not the polite chill of a Missouri November. This was something meaner, something with teeth. The wind tore at her coat and found every gap in the wool, and the snow came sideways, thick and blinding, so she had to squint just to see the driver climbing down from his box. "How bad?" she called up to him. He didn't answer right away. He crouched down beside the left rear wheel, brushed away snow, and then stood back up with the expression of a man who's just lost money. "Axle's clean through," he said. "She ain't moving." Maeve looked up the road, looked back down it. There was nothing in either direction except white. White ground, white air, white sky. The pine trees on either side had disappeared into the storm. She could hear them, though the low groan of the trunks bending under the weight of accumulated ice, but she couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead. "How far to town?" she asked. "1.5 miles, maybe 2. He was already unhitching the lead horse, working fast. "I'll ride in and get help sent back." "And my trunk?" He looked at the trunk through the open coach door. It was 100 pounds if it was an ounce solid leather and iron, packed with her punches, her awls, her edge bevelers, her rolls of heavy gauge waxed thread, and a full set of curved needles, her bone folders, her skiving knives, the wooden forms for collar trees. Everything she owned. Everything she was, professionally speaking. "Leave it," he said. "Come with me on the horse. Trunk'll be here when we send someone back." Maeve considered that for exactly 2 seconds. She'd left things behind before. She knew how that ended. "Go get help," she said. "I'll manage the trunk." He looked at her the way men often did, like he was trying to calculate if she was serious, and then deciding it wasn't his problem either way. He mounted the horse, tucked his chin into his collar, and rode off into the white, and then she was alone. The wind pushed at her back like it wanted her to fall over. She didn't fall over. She stepped up into the tilted coach, braced her boots against the floor, got both hands under the trunk handles, and pulled. It shifted a few inches. She repositioned, pulled again. It moved. She worked it to the doorway in small increments, each pull using her whole body, legs driving, shoulders rotating, arms steady. When it teetered at the edge, she jumped down first, got underneath it, and guided it to the ground rather than letting it crash. It hit the snow with a deep thud. She stood over it for a moment, breathing hard, the cold air burning her lungs. Steam rose from her shoulders. Her fingers were already stiffening inside her gloves. 1.5 miles. She'd walked further than that, in worse conditions, hauling leather bales for her father when she was 16, and the shop mule went lame 3 weeks in a row. She looped the trunk's rope handle over her shoulder, leaned forward, and started walking. The town of Deadwood Basin appeared out of the storm, like something a person might dream up on a bad night. It was a scatter of low timber buildings pressed together along a single mud street, all of it glazed over with ice and soot and general winter misery. Lamplight bled through a few windows. A sign for a dry goods store swayed and banged in the gale. At the far end of the street, she could make out the shape of a church steeple, and closer to her, the widest building on the block, 2 stories, a porch, and a painted sign she had to get close to read. Carmichael's boarding house and saloon. Rooms, meals, spirits. She dragged the trunk up the 2 porch steps, set it down by the door, and went inside. The smell hit her first. Stale whiskey and pipe smoke and wet wool and something underneath all of that. Animal and close. The smell of too many people in a room with too few windows and not enough fresh air. The saloon occupied the ground floor. Maybe a dozen men at the tables, a few at the bar. A fire burned in a stone hearth at the back. A woman in a red dress sat on a piano stool, not playing, just watching the room with tired eyes. Maeve walked to the bar. She set her gloves down on the counter and waited. The man behind the bar had a thick red mustache and small eyes that traveled over her with professional assessment. The kind a man gives when he's deciding what category to put you in. She was used to it. She'd been getting that look since she was 14 and started growing into her father's broad build instead of her mother's narrow one. "Help you?" he said. "I need a room," Maeve said. "My stagecoach lost its axle outside of town. I've got a contract to fulfill here with the saddle maker on Fuller Street, and I'll need lodging until I can arrange permanent quarters." She kept her voice level, polite but clear. She'd learned early that if you led with apology, people smelled it and pressed on it like a bruise. The man's eyes moved down from her face. Down. He scratched the side of his jaw. "Rooms are for respectable guests," he said. She waited. "Traveling alone?" He said. "I am." "No husband? No chaperone?" "No, just me and my tools." Someone at a nearby table made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The kind of sound that doesn't commit to anything but makes its point anyway. "We don't generally accommodate single women." The bartender paused, chose his word with deliberate care. "Your particular circumstances." "My particular circumstances," Maeve repeated. "Size. Situation. Alone." He waved a hand vaguely, like he was describing something unpleasant. "It gives the wrong impression to the other guests. We run a respectable house here." She looked at him. She looked at the men at the tables, at least 3 of whom were visibly drunk before dinner. She looked at the woman on the piano stool, who looked away. "I see," Maeve said. She picked up her gloves. She pulled them back on, finger by finger. She buttoned the top button of her coat, which she'd opened when she came in from the cold. "I have money," she said. U.S. currency. "I have a legitimate contract with a legitimate business in this town. I am a leather craftsperson, not a vagrant, and it is approximately 20 degrees outside." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the bartender said, and he didn't sound it at all. "No," Maeve said. "You're not." She turned and walked out the door. The cold received her like it had been waiting. She stood on the porch for a moment with her hand on the trunk rope and looked up and down the street. The gale had not softened any in the time she'd been inside. If anything, it had found a new gear, driving the snow horizontally down the street so it hissed against the porch posts and packed itself into the corners. Her breath came out in thick clouds. Her feet, which had been starting to warm up inside, began to ache again almost immediately. She pulled the trunk down the steps and back out into the street. There was a hardware store, dark and shuttered, a farrier's shed with a padlock on the door. A small building that might have been a telegraph office, or might have been someone's home, no way to tell. She tried the boarding house again, the side door this time, and knocked for 2 full minutes as before a woman's voice from inside told her to go away or they'd fetch the sheriff. She went away. She tried the livery stable at the end of the block. The man inside took one look at her and said the stalls were full, which they were not. She could see from the doorway that half the stalls were empty. She didn't argue. Arguing cost warmth. Down a side alley, she found a covered space between 2 buildings where the wind cut to maybe half its strength. She got the trunk against the wall, sat on it, and thought. She'd been colder than this. She'd worked through cold before her father's shop had no insulation to speak of, and 2 of the winters she'd spent there, the water in the wash bucket froze solid overnight, and she'd had to break the ice with a hammer before she could condition the leather in the morning. She wasn't fragile. She'd never been fragile. The city had wanted her to be, and she'd always declined. But she was also not stupid. The temperature was dropping as the light dropped, and the blizzard showed no sign of breaking. And she was in a town where she didn't know a single soul, and no one had been inclined to help her. She reached into her coat pocket and checked the paper there, the contract, folded 3 times, her name at the top, and the name of the business below it. Croft Staging and Supply, Deadwood Basin, Dakota Territory. It was already paid half the fee deposited in advance, which meant someone was expecting her, which meant there was at least one person in this town who had engaged her on professional terms. She pulled the trunk back out into the street and started walking in the direction she'd seen a man pointing earlier when another man had asked about the staging post. The snow had gotten into her scarf somehow. There was ice along her hairline. Her shoulder, where the trunk rope dug in, had gone from aching to a dull, distant numbness which she knew from experience meant she needed to shift it or risk losing the circulation. She shifted it and kept walking. The street narrowed and the buildings thinned, and she was almost at the edge of town before she saw the forge. You could see it before anything else, the orange glow through a gap in the wall, pulsing faintly in the dark, warm as a coal in the snow. Next to it, a long, low building, with a peaked roof and a sign she couldn't read from this distance. Beyond that, a cabin, solid built, with light in the window. She was heading toward it when her foot found ice under the snow. She went down hard, the trunk following, and the impact drove the air out of her chest. And for a moment, she just lay there with her face in the snow and the cold coming up through her coat from the ground beneath her. She didn't panic. She took stock. Hands, feet, head, nothing broken. Trunk still intact, thank God for the iron latches. Getting up was harder than it should have been. Her legs had gotten cold without her noticing. The way cold worked sometimes, quietly and incrementally, until you realized you were moving like a person twice your age. She got to one knee, then the other, then upright, leaning against the trunk, until her balance found itself. Again. She was approximately 100 yards from the cabin when the cold took the last of her reserves. She made it maybe 30 more yards, into the tree line, where the pines broke some of the wind, and then her legs simply decided they were done. Not dramatically. They didn't buckle. She just gradually descended, the way a person does when there's nothing left to argue with, until she was kneeling in the snow with her back against a pine trunk, and the trunk in front of her like a small, useless wall. She was not afraid. That was the thing about cold, real cold, the kind that gets inside you. It takes the fear first. Everything became very simple and very quiet. She needed to get up. She would get up in a moment. She just needed a moment. The snow settled on her shoulders, and she let it, because she couldn't feel it anymore anyway. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She was not going to die in Deadwood Basin before she'd done a single day's work here that was simply not acceptable. She'd come too far and given up too much, and she was not going to let the cold or the town or the blizzard or any of it be the end of her story in this place. She put both hands on the trunk and pushed herself back to standing, and that was when she heard the snow crunch behind her. She turned. A man stood at the edge of the tree line, maybe 10 feet away. Tall, heavy-shouldered, wearing a canvas coat over what looked like a smithing apron and carrying a lantern that threw his face into amber relief. His hair was dark and going gray at the temples. There was a scar running from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone that caught the light of the lantern like a seam in weathered wood. He looked at her the way a person looks when they're assessing a situation, rather than a person taking in the trunk, the rope, the snow on her coat, the way she was standing with both hands, gripping the handle like she was afraid to let go. "You Maeve Halloway?" he said. His voice was low and flat and direct, no apology in it, but no cruelty either. Just a voice asking a question. "I am," she said. Her own voice came out rougher than she meant it to. Her jaw had stiffened. "Croft," he said. "Reuben Croft. Your coach driver came in about an hour ago and said he'd left you with your trunk on the roadside." He paused. "I came to find you. I found my own way," she said. "I can see that." He looked at the trunk. "You dragged that all the way from the road?" "I did." He was quiet for a beat. Then he bent down, picked up the trunk by its handles, like it weighed considerably less than it did, and straightened back up. He nodded his head toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said. "You'll freeze out here." She looked at him. She looked at the cabin with its warm window. She looked at the snow coming down around them, which had not stopped and showed no sign of stopping. "I tried the boarding house," she said. "They turned me away." "I know what Carmichael is," Reuben said. He didn't elaborate, and he didn't seem particularly surprised. "My cabin's got a hearth and a bed and a pot of venison stew that's been going since noon. That suit you?" She studied him for another moment. The scar, the steady eyes, the lantern held easy in one hand, the trunk in the other, like it was nothing. She had spent 8 months in St. Louis, being told that a woman of her size and temperament was unmanageable, undesirable, an embarrassment to be hidden. She had been ejected from a family, stripped of an inheritance, pushed out of a city she'd helped build with her own 2 hands. And she had walked 2 miles through a Dakota blizzard, dragging a 100-pound trunk because she was not going to let any of it be the last word on who she was. She trusted her instincts. Her instincts had kept her alive this long. "That'll suit me fine," she said. Reuben nodded once, turned, and started walking toward the cabin. He carried her trunk like it was a satchel. She followed him through the snow, and the wind at her back was still biting, still mean, still trying to push her off course. But the light in that cabin window was amber and steady, and it pulled like something certain through the white dark. The door opened. Heat rolled out to meet her, the thick, immediate heat of a well-tended fire, pine wood and iron, and something rich from the pot on the stove. Her body moved toward it before her mind made any decision. The warmth hit the ice along her hairline, and she felt it melt, felt the feeling come flooding back into her fingers and her feet with the particular bright pain of returning circulation. Reuben set the trunk down against the wall, hung his lantern on the hook by the door, and turned to look at her. "Coat," he said. Not an order, more like a reminder. She unbuttoned it, her fingers still clumsy with cold. He didn't offer to help, and she was glad of that. She looked around the cabin while she worked the buttons. It was one large room, rough-hewn walls, heavy timber beams, a stone hearth that took up most of one wall, with a fire burning high in it, a workbench along one side with tools she recognized immediately, leather stamps, a half-finished collar sitting in a clamp, a braiding jig, a wide bed against the far wall, built from timber, piled with sheepskins and heavy wool blankets, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a few canned goods, a rifle on pegs above the door. It was a working man's room. No ornamentation, no excess. Everything in it was there because it was useful. She pulled off her coat and hung it on the peg he indicated. She pulled off her scarf. Her boots were soaked through, and she sat down in the nearest chair and worked at the laces. "There's dry socks on the shelf behind the stove," Reuben said. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table without making a performance of it. "Thank you," she said. She ate standing up first because sitting still felt wrong, felt like surrender to the cold and the long walk and the long day and the long 8 months before it. The stew was good venison and root vegetables and something dark and savory she couldn't identify, thickened with what might have been ground corn. She ate the whole bowl and some of the bread he put beside it, and when she sat down properly, her hands had stopped shaking. Reuben sat across the table with a mug of something, not stew, and said nothing. He didn't try to fill the silence with conversation, and that was something she noticed and filed away. After a while, she said, "The boarding house, is that common here?" "Depends on who's doing the asking," he said. She looked at him. "You're a large woman traveling alone," he said. "Not unkind." Not apologetic either. Factual. The way a surveyor describes terrain. Carmichael doesn't know what to do with that, so he does nothing and calls it policy. And you? She said. I know what a contract is, he said, and I know what a craftsperson looks like. You came to do a job. That's enough. The fire crackled. The blizzard pushed at the window panes and found them solid. Somewhere outside, the wind was doing something eerie and long through the pine trees. Maeve looked at the hearth, at the sheepskin-piled bed beyond it, at the ceiling where the firelight moved in slow patterns. She was bone-tired. Not the ordinary, tired of a long day, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves rigid for months, refusing to break, and has now, in a warm room with stew in her stomach and nobody watching, finally run out of the energy required to stay braced. She looked at Reuben Croft. He was watching the fire, his mug balanced on one knee, the scar on his face casting a thin shadow in the shifting light. "Where do I sleep?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. There was a layer under the question that she hadn't entirely meant to put there, the layer of someone who has been told, in various ways and by various people, that wherever she went, she took up too much space, too much room, too much of everything, that she was always, in one way or another, more than was wanted. Reuben set his mug down on the table. He stood up and walked to the bed beside the hearth. He folded back the heavy wool blanket with one deliberate motion all the way to the far edge, making it wide. He looked at her, not assessing, not weighing, just direct. "Right here," he said. 2 words, plain as pine boards, certain as the fire behind him. Maeve looked at the bed, at the firelight on the sheepskin, at the space he'd opened without hesitation, without calculation, without any of the arithmetic the world had always been doing around her. She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt expected. Not in spite of who she was. Not despite her size, or her calloused hands, or her lack of a chaperone, or her coat that smelled like leather oil and road dust. Expected because of all of it. Because she had dragged 100 pounds 2 miles through a blizzard, and knocked on every door in town, and found her own way to the tree line, and this man had come out into the storm with a lantern specifically to find her. She stood from the table. She walked to the hearth. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and the warmth from the fire came against her face and her hands, and the sheepskin was impossibly soft under her palms. And for a moment, she just sat very still and let herself exist in a warm room where no door had been shut against her. Outside, the blizzard was still screaming. Inside, the fire held. She didn't sleep right away. The fire was too warm after the cold, and her body didn't know what to do with warmth anymore. It kept bracing for the next gust of wind, the next drop in temperature, the next door closing in her face. She lay on top of the blanket, still in her dry clothes. Reuben had gone to the other side of the room, pulled a second bedroll from a wooden chest, and settled himself near the workbench without discussion. And she stared at the ceiling while the pine logs shifted and popped in the hearth. The blizzard had not relented. She could hear it working at the cabin from every angle, testing the joins in the timber, pushing snow against the base of the door in a low, steady hiss. But the cabin held. The walls were thick, the chinking solid, and the fire Reuben had built burned with the confidence of a man who knew how to build fires in serious cold. She listened to his breathing across the room. It was even, unhurried, the breathing of a man who had made his decision and settled into it, no second guessing. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the fire had burned down to deep orange coals, and the room was still warm but dimmer, and she was cold, not bitterly cold, not like the road. But her feet had lost their warmth again, and her fingers, curled against her sternum, were stiff. She'd been still too long, and the cold had found the gaps between her and the blanket she'd been too cautious to get under. She sat up slowly. Across the room, Reuben's bedroll was empty. She heard him before she saw him, the soft sound of iron moving against iron, the low breath of someone working by feel in the dark. He was at the hearth, crouched down, adding a split log to the coals, building the fire back up with the practiced quiet of a man trying not to wake someone. He didn't look over at her, just worked the log into place, added a second, and held a folded piece of leather over the embers until the flames caught and climbed. "You're cold," he said. "Not a question." "I'm fine," she said. Automatic. 8 months of automatic. He turned then. The firelight was coming up behind him, and it caught the angles of his face, the strong jaw, the scar, the dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive. He looked at her with the patient attention of someone who has spent years reading terrain and weather and knows when conditions are being misrepresented. "Come here," he said. She didn't move right away. He stood up from the hearth and walked to the bed, and he pulled back the wool blanket, the heavy one, the top one, and folded it to the side the same way he had earlier. An invitation, uncomplicated. "You'll warm faster under the sheepskin," he said. "The cold gets in from the outside walls after midnight. Happens every winter. The hearth side of the bed holds the heat." She looked at him, at the bed, at the firelight that had come up strong now, painting the sheepskin gold. "You pulled out a bedroll for yourself," she said. "I did." "Why?" He considered the question as though it deserved consideration. "Because you didn't know me," he said, "and you'd had a long enough day without having to navigate anything extra." She sat with that for a moment. In St. Louis, in the fine house where she'd spent 18 months believing she was building a life, the men she'd known had explained their consideration of her in terms of what she ought to be grateful for. Reuben hadn't explained anything. He'd made a practical decision for a plain reason and stated it like a fact. And now he was offering her the warmer side of the bed because the outside wall was cold, and there was nothing in his face that said she owed him anything for any of it. She got up. She crossed the room to the bed. She sat on the edge of it and swung her legs under the blanket, and the warmth that had been held inside the wool and sheepskin from the hours before closed around her like a hand. She lay down. The pillow smelled like pine and iron and something faintly like the saddle oil she used herself. And that smell was so familiar, so much like her father's shop in the mornings, that her chest tightened in a way she didn't expect. Reuben stood for a moment. Then he sat on the edge of the bed beside her, not under the blanket, just on the edge, like a man who's keeping watch rather than taking up residence. She looked at him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Stay awake." "I'm not tired," he said. They were quiet. The fire breathed and settled. Outside, a long gust of wind pushed across the roof and went. "How long has this been your land?" she asked. "My father built the stake post," he said. "I grew up running dispatch on it. Took it over when he passed." He paused. 15 years of my own running it now. And the railroad wants it. The railroad wants the choke point," he said. "There's only one route through this valley that doesn't hit granite shelf or swamp. My post sits on it." Another pause. "Sterling's been sending letters for 2 years. Letters turn to lawyers. Lawyers are about to turn to something else." She heard it in his voice, not fear. Something quieter than fear and harder to name. The sound of a man who has already lost things and knows what loss feels like coming. "I read about Sterling," she said, "before I came out here. The Western Pacific Syndicate." She watched the ceiling. "He's the same man who bought out the commercial district in St. Louis 4 years ago. Drove out every independent craftsperson on Merchant Row. That included my father's leather shop." Reuben looked at her. "My father built that shop from nothing," she said. 40 years. Sterling Syndicate bought the building, tripled the lease overnight, and when my father couldn't pay, they offered to buy the business for 1/10 of its value." She kept her voice steady. She told this story before, mostly to herself, mostly late at night. He took it. He was 62 years old, and he was tired. "And you?" "I was his apprentice. His successor," he always said. "But the shop wasn't mine yet legally, and when the sale went through, I had no claim." She turned her head to look at Reuben. "I had a fiancé at the time, man named Aldous Pemberton. His family had money, not railroad money, but enough." I thought. She stopped, considered how to say it. I thought I had somewhere to land. You didn't? Reuben said. It wasn't a question either. He'd heard the shape of the story. His mother called me coarse, Maeve said. His father said I was built like a dock worker, and that Aldous deserved a wife who looked the part. She almost smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Aldous didn't disagree loudly enough to matter. Reuben said nothing for a moment. The fire popped. A knot in the pine log burst with a soft concussion and sent a shower of sparks up the flue. Men like that, he said finally, they need women to be smaller than them. In every way. It's not about you. It's about what they can't stand to face in themselves. She looked at him. That's an interesting thing for a man to say. I've had time to think, he said, simply. She believed him. There was a quality to his stillness that wasn't passivity. It was the stillness of someone who had spent time alone with serious things and hadn't flinched away from them, she asked, because she could hear that there was something in the silence that wanted to be said. What happened to your family? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Raiders, he said. Land speculators. Same breed as Sterling, different company. They sent men to clear the staging route 5 years ago. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He looked at the fire. My wife, my son. He was 3. The word 3 dropped into the room and sat there. Maeve didn't say she was sorry. She'd been told she was sorry enough times after her own losses to know how hollow it sat. She reached out instead and put her hand over his, where it rested on his knee. Just that, no words around it. His hand turned over under hers, not pulling away. Just acknowledging the contact, the way 2 people acknowledge each other when language has reached its limit. They stayed like that for a while. The fire burned high and steady, and the blizzard outside pushed and found no purchase, and the cabin was warm, and the room was quiet, and somewhere in the middle of that quiet, something between them shifted. Not dramatically. The way the light in a room shifts when the clouds move outside, and more sun comes through gradual, and then suddenly obvious. She became aware of him, not as a stranger, not as a benefactor, as a person beside her in the dark. A specific, present, complicated person, warm-shouldered and scarred and honest in a way she hadn't encountered in a very long time. He became aware of her at the same moment. She could feel it in the slight change of his breathing, the way his hand, still under hers, had stilled completely. He looked at her. In the firelight she was. He registered this slowly, in pieces remarkable. Not the word the city would have used. Not by any of the city's measurements. But remarkable by the only measurements that had ever meant anything to him. Presence, endurance, the quality of a person who has been tested and not broken. Her shoulders were broad and strong, the line of them visible even through her shirt. Her face was flushed from the fire's warmth, and her dark hair had come loose from whatever she'd pinned it into for the journey, and lay across the pillow in a way that was entirely unself-conscious. Her hands, one still resting on his, were calloused across the palm and the first knuckle of every finger, the hands of someone who worked with them every day. He thought about the trunk. 100 pounds of iron tools, 2 miles in a blizzard, on a shoulder that was probably already aching before she picked it up. He thought about the way she'd been standing in the tree line when he found her upright, one hand on the trunk, refusing to go down, even when her legs had given her every reason to. Maeve, he said. His voice had changed. She heard the change in it, and it moved through her like the warmth of the fire had earlier, starting at the surface and going deeper. You looked at me, she said quietly, the same way you looked at me in the tree line. How's that? Like I'm here, she said. Not too much. Not the wrong kind. Just here. He reached out, slow, giving her every moment to decide against it. His hand found the curve of her shoulder, where the muscle ran from her neck down to her arm, and he held it there. Not gripping. Just present. Her breath came out unsteady. You've been bracing yourself all day, he said. All year, she said. You can stop, he said. For right now in this room. You can stop. She looked at him for a long moment, searching, the way a person searches when they've been given wrong directions, enough times that they don't trust maps anymore. But his face was plain and steady, and the same as it had been since he walked out of the tree line with a lantern to find her. She stopped bracing. It came out of her in a long breath, the kind that has more than air in it. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Her jaw unclenched, her hand on his turned over completely, palm up. He moved slowly. His hands were a blacksmith's hands, heavy, scarred at the knuckles, permanently darkened at the creases from years of iron and coal, and he moved them with a deliberateness that made everything feel intentional. Considered, he was not a man who did things accidentally. He traced the curve of her shoulder, down the line of her upper arm, where the muscle was dense from years of heavy work. She felt the roughness of his palms against her skin, and it was not gentle in the pretty decorative way that gentleness was supposed to be. It was something more like careful. The care a craftsperson gives to material they respect. She'd spent a year being told her body was wrong. Too much. Built wrong for a woman. Too heavy, too solid, taking up space in the wrong proportions. She had heard those words in drawing rooms, and in a letter from Aldous' mother, and in the bartender's slow, assessing look tonight, and she had carried them the way you carry something you're not sure what to do with you always, even when you'd rather put them down. Reuben's hands moved to her waist. He didn't reach around tentatively, didn't navigate it like an obstacle. He held her there, both hands, with a steadiness that felt like a statement. She felt the warmth of his palms through the fabric of her shirt, and it was all she could do to stay in the moment and not retreat behind everything she'd been told. "You're looking at something," he said quietly. He'd noticed her eyes had gone somewhere else. "Trying to," she said. "Trying to. Just be here. What's in the way?" She met his eyes. 8 months of being told, "I'm not what anyone wants." He held her gaze. His hands didn't move. "Then let me be plain," he said. "So there's no question." His voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "I found you in a blizzard, and I brought you in from the cold, and I would have done that for anyone. But I'm sitting here now, with you, because I want to. Not out of obligation, not out of pity." He let the words sit for a moment. "Do you understand the difference?" She did. She had not understood it, perhaps, until he said it out loud, but she understood it now. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He turned his face slightly into her palm, and that small motion, that simple, unguarded lean, undid something in her that had been knotted tight for a very long time. She kissed him, not tentatively. She was not a tentative person, and she was not going to start being one now. She kissed him with all the directness she had, the same directness she used when she argued a contract, when she threw a punch through heavy cowhide, when she looked a man like Carmichael in the eye and told him what he was. He responded in kind. His arm came around her back, and it was solid and warm, and he kissed her back with a focus that said she had his complete attention. The fire was high, and the room was hot, and the blizzard was still screaming outside, and none of that existed anymore in any meaningful way. The world had contracted to this cabin, this bed, the two of them, the heat between them that had nothing to do with the hearth. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His thumb moved along her cheekbone. "Still here," he said. "Still here," she said. She was, entirely, physically, without reservation, here. Not half present the way she'd been in her life in St. Louis, always monitoring how much space she was taking up, always adjusting her posture or her voice or her laugh so it didn't register as too much. She was here in a way she hadn't been in so long, she'd forgotten it was possible. His hands moved over her with the same deliberate attention he'd started with. He was not in a hurry. She'd been with men who treated urgency like a virtue, who moved through intimacy like it was a destination to arrive at. Reuben moved like a man who understood that the thing itself was the point. His hands found the full curve of her hip and held it with both palms flat, and the naturalness of the gesture like this was simply where his hands wanted to be broke, the last of her self-consciousness open. She stopped measuring herself. It was not a dramatic moment. It was quiet, like most true things are. 1 second she was still carrying the weight of every critical eye that had ever moved across her body, and found it lacking. And the next she had simply set that weight down. Put it on the floor beside the bed. Left it there. What remained was just her. Present, warm, strong in her own skin. She pulled him closer, and his breath came out rough against her neck, and she felt the size of him, his broad back, the density of muscle in his shoulders, and she matched him. Not diminished, not apologizing for the space she occupied. Matched, equal in mass and warmth and want, and the rightness of that was so simple it almost made her laugh. She didn't laugh. She pressed her face against his collarbone and felt his heartbeat, rapid and certain, and she stayed very still for a moment just to feel it. His arms were around her completely. Outside, the blizzard broke against the walls and failed. Inside, the fire burned lower and slower, the way a fire does when it's past the height of it and settling into something sustainable and long. The room was amber and close and warm. She could feel every place where they were touching and every place where they weren't. And both mattered equally. He said her name low once. She said his back. They lay still together in the sheepskin and the warmth, and she listened to his breathing slow and even out. And she watched the fire paint patterns on the ceiling, and for the first time in 8 months, she was not bracing for the next thing. She was simply where she was. She was 30 years old. She had calloused hands and a broad back and 100-pound trunk of tools against the wall. And she had been cast out of a city and a family and a life she'd tried to build. She had walked 2 miles through a blizzard and knocked on every door in a town that didn't want her, and she had found her own way to the tree line. And someone had come out with a lantern into the storm specifically to look for her. She had a contract to fulfill, work to do, a town to prove herself to. But that was morning. Right now the fire was warm, and the wind was losing, and Reuben Croft was asleep beside her with one arm still across her waist, and Maeve Halloway lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt not happy exactly. Not yet. It was too soon, and they were both too scarred for easy happiness, but settled. Grounded. Like a post driven deep enough that the weather couldn't move it. Like a person who has found, after a very long time searching, a place they might actually be allowed to stay. She closed her eyes. This time she slept. She woke before him. The fire had burned to coals again, and the room was gray, with early light coming through the single east-facing window. The blizzard had stopped sometime in the night. She could tell by the quality of the silence. No wind, no hiss of snow against the walls. Just the deep, muffled quiet of a world that had been buried overnight and hadn't started moving again yet. Maeve lay still for a moment and took stock. Her shoulder was sore where the trunk rope had dug in. Her feet were warm. The sheepskin smelled like wood smoke and the particular dusty warmth of sleep. Reuben was breathing steadily beside her, one arm thrown over his own eyes, his chest rising and falling slow. She sat up carefully and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She found her boots by the door, dry now, and pulled them on. Her coat she left hanging on the peg. The cabin was cold, but not bitterly. So the coals still giving off heat, and she opened the trunk and pulled out her work apron. Oiled canvas, reinforced at the pockets, with 3 leather tool loops along the left hip. She tied it on, checked the tool loops by feel, and looked around the room. The hearth needed wood. She found the stack outside the back door, 3 steps from the cabin in the snow, and she made 2 trips to bring enough in to build the fire up properly. She laid it the way her father had taught her tinder in first, split kindling in a cross pattern, a split log on each side to create a channel for air, and she had it burning clean before the gray light in the window had gone to white. She put the coffee pot on. She was standing at Reuben's workbench, examining the half-finished collar and the clamp, when she heard him move. "You built the fire," he said. His voice was rough with sleep. "It needed doing," she said. She heard him sit up. A pause. Then the sound of boots. He came to stand beside her at the workbench and looked at the collar in the clamp, and then at her. And he didn't say anything for a moment. Just looked at her the way a person looks when they've woken up, and the thing they went to sleep thinking about is still there, still real. And that's a surprise and not a bad one. "Coffee's on," she said. "I can smell it." He reached past her and turned the collar in the clamp slightly, showing her the seam. "I've been fighting this join for 2 days. The hide's got a natural pull in it, and I can't get the edges to lay flat." She bent to look at it. The hide was good quality, vegetable tanned, firm but supple. But he was right. There was a grain variance at the join that was causing one edge to cup slightly. She touched it with her thumb, feeling the tension in the leather. "You need to dampen it," she said. "Warm water, not hot. Let it sit for 20 minutes, then case it with a bone folder along the seam line before you stitch. The moisture relaxes the fiber, and the folding sets a memory into it. It'll lay flat once it dries." He looked at the join, then at her thumb still pressing the leather. "Show me," he said. She did. She worked at his bench while he got the coffee, and came back to watch, and she explained. What she was doing as she did it, the dampening, the casework, the way you move the bone folder with consistent pressure in the direction of the grain rather than against it. Her hands were sure and quick, and she didn't rush the explanation, didn't talk down to it. She just described what she was doing and why, the same way her father had described it to her. "Where'd you learn?" Reuben asked. He was leaning against the bench with his mug, watching her hands. "My father's shop," she said. "He started me on light harness work. When I was 9, said I had the right hands for it, strong enough to work heavy hide, but sensitive enough to feel the grain." She ran her thumb along the seam again, checking by the time I was 14, I was doing full collar repair. 16, I was cutting patterns for custom saddles. And the shop was in St. Louis. 40 years my father built it, she said. Before Sterling Syndicate decided the building was worth more than the business. She said it without bitterness. She'd processed the bitterness, had walked it out of herself on that 2-mile road through the blizzard. She suspected, and what was left was just fact. It had happened. It had brought her here. She was here. Reuben watched her for a moment, then drained his mug and set it on the shelf. "I need to open the forge," he said. "Got freighting wagons coming through after noon, assuming the road's passable. If you want to work, I can use the help." She looked up from the collar. "You haven't heard my rates." "State them." She named a figure. It was the same figure she'd charged in St. Louis. Fair by any market she'd worked in. He nodded. "Done." "You didn't negotiate," she said. "You named a fair rate," he said. "Negotiating a fair rate is just trying to take something that isn't yours." She looked at him for a beat, then looked back down at the collar. "All right," she said. "Let's open the forge." The forge was attached to the staging post barn by a covered passage, a smart piece of construction, Maeve thought, that let you move between the two without fighting the weather. The staging post itself was more substantial than it had looked from the outside the night before. It was a working operation. 3 large stalls for passenger horses, a freight bay wide enough for 2 wagons side by side, a harness room, a water pump inside the barn that Reuben had clearly engineered himself to prevent freezing, and an office with a roll-top desk and a wall of filing cubbies. The forge took up a room and a half at the south end with a ceiling vent and 2 windows that could be propped open for summer work. The anvil was a 200-pound London pattern, well-used and well-maintained, its face dressed smooth and its horn unmarked by careless strikes. She noticed that an abused anvil told you a great deal about a smith's character. Reuben had the fire going in the forge in 20 minutes. He worked the bellows with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times, and the coals went from gray to orange to white orange, and the heat built in the room fast. He put iron in the fire and let it sit, and while it heated, he explained the morning's work. 3 sets of wagon wheel rims needed truing, a 5th wheel kingpin assembly that had cracked and needed welding at the flange, and 2 sets of trace chains that needed new links to replace corroded sections. I can handle the trace chains while you do the ironwork, Maeve said. If you've got the stock. He pointed to a wall of hooks where sorted lengths of chain hung alongside heavy cord, rivets, and hardware. Below it, a shelf of tools she recognized and some she didn't. There's harness work, too, he said. Back room. 6 collar pads need restuffing, and 2 sets of hame straps have blown their stitching. Show me where the materials are, and I'll get started. He showed her. He was efficient about it, no unnecessary talking, no hovering. He pointed to what she needed, told her where to find what he hadn't pointed to, and then went back to the forge. She went to the harness room and got to work. The collar pads were straightforward, linen covers over compressed straw stuffing, several of which had blown their seams under load. She stripped them down, checked the panel boards underneath for damage 2 needed replacement, which she fashioned from scrap hide and restuffed them with fresh straw that was baled in the corner. She stitched the covers back on with a baseball stitch, using heavy waxed linen thread, pulling each stitch tight and even. It was meditative work. Her hands knew it so well that her mind could move around in it freely. She could hear Reuben at the anvil. The rhythm of it came through the wall strike. Shift, strike, shift, rotate the unhurried cadence of someone working iron, while it was in the right heat range. No wasted motion, no panic. A good smith could tell you everything about a man's temperament by the sound of his hammer. Reuben's tempo was even and deliberate, which told her something she'd already suspected. The morning passed in that way, parallel work, separate focus, the shared sounds of a forge, and a harness room in operation. It was comfortable. She hadn't expected it to be comfortable. She'd expected the morning after to carry some weight of awkwardness, the social negotiation of 2 people who'd crossed a line they hadn't planned to cross. But the awkwardness hadn't arrived. Reuben came through to the harness room around mid-morning to check on the collar pads, and he looked at her work without commenting for a moment, turning one of the finished pads over in his hands. Even throughout, he said. No high spots. My father's standard, she said. An uneven pad creates pressure points under the collar. You get it wrong, you lame the horse, and you lose the whole day's work. I know, he said. I've had to deal with 3 sets of collar sores this season from the freight company's suppliers. They're using pads that haven't been properly stuffed. He set the collar down. It costs the freighters 2 days every time a horse comes up sore. They absorb it because they don't know it can be different. It can be different, Maeve said. That's what I'm telling them, Reuben said. He went back to the forge. She sat with that for a moment. The straightforwardness of it. He'd just made her point in the middle of a practical conversation about horses, and done it so naturally that it took her a second to recognize it as the defense it was. He'd been defending the standard of her work before she'd even had to state it. She picked up the next collar pad and kept stitching. The freight wagons arrived at noon. 2 of them, heavy-loaded, pulled by 4-horse teams that looked like they'd been through the same storm she had. They came down the main road into town from the north, and they pulled into the staging post bay while Reuben was still at the anvil, and Maeve was on her second set of hame straps. She heard the wagons before she heard the men, and she came out of the harness room with the hame strap in her hand when the voices got loud. There were 3 men with the wagons, 2 drivers, and a man riding alongside on a heavy black horse. The rider was the one talking, which he was doing at volume, listing complaints about road conditions and axle grease, and something about a toll arrangement that he'd apparently expected to be different than it was. Reuben came out of the forge and listened without interrupting. When the man was done, Reuben addressed the 2 drivers by name, told them where to pull the wagons, and started unhooking the lead horses with the practice of a man who did this daily. The rider stayed mounted. His eyes moved to Maeve, still standing in the harness room doorway with the strap in her hand. "Who's this?" he said. "Maeve Halloway," Reuben said, not looking up from the harness. "Leather crafter." She's doing the collar work and the hame repairs. The writer looked her over with the same species of assessment she'd gotten from Carmichael last night, the slow inventory, the quiet arithmetic. She recognized it, and she waited. Seems an unusual arrangement, the writer said. His name, she'd gather later, was Stokes, a freight company supervisor, out of Bismarck. It's a working arrangement, Reuben said. He did look up then. She's skilled, she's contracted, and she's doing the work your company's freight stock needs. Is there a part of that that's a problem for you? Stokes considered this. He looked at Maeve again. She held his gaze. She didn't explain herself. Her father had taught her that explaining yourself to a man who hadn't asked a real question was just performing for his approval, and she'd stopped doing that at 17. Stokes got down from his horse. "Let me see the collar work," he said. She stepped aside and let him into the harness room. He picked up one of the finished pads, same as Reuben had, and turned it over. He pressed it at various points, testing the stuffing density. He ran his thumb along the seam stitching. "This is better than what I've been buying from the supplier in Bismarck," he said. He sounded slightly irritated about it, the way people do when they realize they've been paying for something inferior. "Most things are better when they're done by someone who knows what they're doing," Maeve said. He set the pad down. "You fix hame straps too?" She held up the one in her hand. He looked at it. "What's your rate?" he said. She told him. "For this volume?" "Same rate," she said. "Quality doesn't change with volume." He stood for a moment, doing the calculation. Then he pulled off his glove and put out his hand. She shook it. "I'll want 6 collar pads, 2 full sets of hame straps, and a trace repair on the second wagon's offside lead," he said. "Have it done before my return run next week." "I'll have it done by Friday," she said. He gave a short nod and went back out to speak to Reuben about the wheelwork. Maeve went back to her stitching. 30 minutes later, she heard Reuben outside speaking to both drivers and Stokes as they examined the repaired rim on the first wagon wheel. The drivers were moving the wheel on the axle, checking the fit, and Reuben was explaining what he'd done at the flange. Then she heard him say, clearly, "For the benefit of the group, and when you come through next week, you talk to Maeve Holloway about your harness stock. She's doing the leather work here, and she does it right. You've got any doubt about that? Look at the collar pads she finished this morning." Stokes said something she couldn't hear. "No," Reuben said. "She's not a helper. She's a craftsperson with 15 years of experience and a fair rate. You treat her accordingly." Another response from Stokes, too low to catch. "Good," Reuben said. Conversation moved on to the axle grease question. Maeve sat with the hame strap across her lap, and she looked at the wall for a moment. She had not asked him to do that. She had not needed him to do that. She could advocate for herself, and had been doing so successfully since she was old enough to write a contract. But there was a difference between a woman defending her own worth to a skeptical room and a man declining to be skeptical in the first place. He'd done it publicly, with witnesses, without making a speech about it. He just stated the fact and expected it to be received as one. Her father had done that for her, once upon a time. In his shop, on his floor, she'd been introduced as his craftsperson and successor, not his daughter learning a useful skill. It had made a difference to how she was treated by the men who came in. She finished the seam, cut the thread, and picked up the next strap. The afternoon brought more visitors than she'd expected for a town that had just come through a blizzard. 2 local ranchers came by for shoe work on their horses. A woman from the dry goods store heavyset, 60s, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she held opinions and wasn't ashamed of having them, came to the staging post office door with a delivery of accounting ledgers and looked at Maeve with frank curiosity. "Martha Hayes," the woman said. She did not extend her hand right away. "Maeve Holloway," Maeve said. "I heard," Martha said. "Carmichael's been talking about last night, about how you showed up at his door." Maeve waited. "He made it sound worse than I expect it was," Martha said. She studied Maeve with an assessment that was blunter and more honest than Stokes's had been. "You're doing the leather work here?" "I am." Martha's eyes went to the hame strap in Maeve's hand, then to the finished collar pads stacked on the workbench. She picked one up, pressed it, put it back. Carmichael's been talking to Sterling's people, Martha said. She said this the way someone passes information they think you need, not casually, with specific intent. Sterling's man was in the store this morning, asking questions about Reuben's operation, about the post's revenue, its contracts, its staffing. She paused. He seemed interested in the fact that Reuben had taken on a new employee. Why would that interest him? Maeve said, though she had a suspicion. Because Sterling's looking for any angle he can use, Martha said. A single woman living at the staging post without a chaperone, that's a social weapon if you know how to use it in front of a town council. Maeve looked at her. Is that what you think it is? Martha looked back. Something behind her eyes moved, recalibrated. What I think, she said carefully, is that it's not my business what the arrangement is. What I think is that Carmichael is a coward and Sterling is worse, and if they're going to use it as a weapon, you ought to know the weapon's being loaded. Maeve nodded. I appreciate that. Martha looked at her for another beat. Then she gave a short nod, tucked the ledgers under her arm, and walked back into the cold. Maeve stood in the doorway and watched her go. Sterling. She'd known his name for 4 years, had tied it to the loss of her father's shop and the collapse of everything she'd built toward in St. Louis. And now here he was again, at the edge of the same story, different territory. Men like that didn't stop. They moved from parcel to parcel, from town to town, buying and seizing and crushing the small working operations that held communities together, and they justified it by calling it progress. She went back inside. She was at the workbench when Reuben came in from the bay, wiping his hands on a rag, with the particular look of a man who'd heard something on the wind. Martha talked to you? He said. She did, Maeve said. Sterling's man is in town, he said. Was in town yesterday, actually, before the storm. He pulled up the stool at the end of the bench and sat on it. He's been meeting with 2 of the town councilmen, Vess and Aldridge. They've taken money, most likely, though you can't prove it yet. What's he offering? Maeve said. Railroad spur to the edge of town, Reuben said. Economic development. Prosperity. All the words that sound good until you read what they're attached to. He folded the rag. What they're attached to is a land survey that routes the rail line directly through my staging post parcel and gives the syndicate right of way without compensation. That's federal land law violation, Maeve said. I know it is, he said, but federal law enforcement is a circuit judge who comes through 3 times a year, and Sterling's had 2 months to do his work before the judge's next scheduled circuit. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him sitting on that stool, talking about the man who wanted to take everything he had with the same level tone he used to discuss collar pad construction. When does the judge come through? She said. January, Reuben said. 6 weeks, give or take. 6 weeks is enough time, Maeve said. If you have the right documentation. I have the original survey deeds, he said. My father's and mine. I have the freight contracts going back 12 years. He paused. What I don't have is someone who knows mercantile law well enough to make the argument before a judge. She looked at the hame strap in her hands, at her own calloused fingers. I worked for 2 years as a contract writer for independent merchants in St. Louis before I went back to leather work full-time, she said. Writing contracts, reading deeds, arguing terms. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know what Sterling's likely to file, and I know enough to know how to file against it. Reuben looked at her. Tell me what you have, she said. Every deed, every contract, every letter Sterling sent. I want to see all of it. He got up from the stool without a word, went to the office, and came back with a wooden box. He set it on the workbench between them and lifted the lid. Inside, folded papers, letters, a bound ledger, a small rolled map. She set the hame strap aside. She spread the map on the workbench and bent over it, and Reuben leaned in beside her. And outside the staging post, the afternoon was going gold and cold, and the town of Deadwood Basin was moving through its ordinary business, not knowing yet what was being laid out on a workbench in the forge building at the end of the main road. The fire in the forge had burned down while they were talking. Maeve noticed it, got up, worked the bellows until the coals came back to life and came back to the map. "Here's the survey line," Reuben said. He traced it with one finger. "My grandfather's original claim. Registered 1,849. She looked at it. Then she looked at the letter from Sterling's syndicate, which had a hand-drawn counter-survey attached, that moved the property line approximately 40 yards east. She picked up the letter. "Read it. Read it again." "This counter-survey is dated 3 months ago," she said. "Yes," Reuben said. "That's after the Homestead Consolidation Act of 1874, she said, "which means any counter-survey filed against an original pre-1860 claim has to go through federal land review before it can alter property line designation." She looked at him. "They can't legally file this without federal review. If they try to use it in front of the judge, it's invalid on its face." Reuben was very still. "Sterling probably knows that," she said, "which means he's not planning to use the court. He's planning to use the council vote to declare the parcel under commercial development exemption before the judge arrives." "Can he do that?" Reuben said. "Not if the judge gets here first," she said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The coals in the forge glowed orange behind them, steady and hot, and the late afternoon light came through the forge windows in long, low bars that crossed the workbench and lit the edges of the papers spread between them. "We need to send a letter to the circuit court," Maeve said, "formally requesting that Judge Vance's scheduled circuit be moved up. We state that there's an active property dispute with federal implications and request emergency adjudication." She tapped the original survey deed. "We attached this." "I've never petitioned a court before," Reuben said. "I have," she said. "Twice in St. Louis, both times successfully." He studied her. Something in his face had shifted, not in the way his expression changed during intimate moments, but in a different register. The way a man looks at a colleague whose competence has just expanded beyond what he'd already understood it to be. "All right," he said. "I'll need paper," she said, "and I'll need an hour tonight after dinner." "Both of those I've got," he said. She rolled the map back up and set it carefully in the box. She stacked the letters in the order she'd need them, anchored them with a piece of iron bar stock from the bench. Then she picked up the hame strap and went back to the stitching. Because the work didn't stop because the stakes had gotten higher. The freight company needed the strap by Friday, and she had given her word on that, and her word was worth more than her anxiety. Reuben went back to the forge. The anvil started up again, even and deliberate, and the fire burned, and the room was warm with work, and somewhere in town a man named Sterling was talking to councilmen with money in an envelope. He didn't know yet what was sitting on the workbench at Croft Staging and Supply. He didn't know what Maeve Halloway knew, but he was going to find out. The second storm came in on a Thursday. It arrived without the drama of the first one, no warning crack of a stagecoach axle, no sudden drop in light. It just settled over Deadwood Basin like a lid being pressed down on a pot, steady and total. And by mid-morning, the visibility outside the forge windows had gone to white, and the temperature had dropped past the point where Maeve's breath stopped steaming and started crystallizing on the inside of her scarf. Reuben came in from checking the barn animals and stamped the snow off his boots at the door. "Road's gone," he said. "Both directions. We're in until this breaks." Maeve looked up from the trace chain she was riveting. "How long?" "Could be a day. Could be 3. He pulled off his coat and hung it. "The freight runs will reroute to the Eastern Pass. We won't see travelers until the road's packed back down. 3 days." She did the mental accounting, the work she had on hand, the materials she needed that she had, the letter to the circuit court that she'd finished 2 nights ago, and Reuben had given to the postal rider the morning before the storm moved in. The letter was sent. Everything that could be done was done. Now they waited. "All right," she said, and went back to the rivet. Those first 2 days were good days, in the plain and functional sense. They worked. They ate. They talked in the evenings, by the fire, not the urgent, necessary talking of the first nights, but the quieter, more exploratory conversation of two people who were beginning to map each other. She told him about the leather trade, about the grades of hide, and what each was good for, about the chemistry of vegetable tanning versus bark tanning, and why the difference mattered in wet climates. He told her about the staging routes, about how freighting networks operated, about the particular economics of a frontier supply chain that most people never thought about until it broke down. He was smart. She'd known that already, but she kept finding new corners of it. He'd read widely more than she'd expected from a man who spent most of his life working iron, and he had opinions about what he'd read, real opinions, the kind formed from thinking rather than from wanting to sound a certain way. She liked that. She liked waking in the morning and finding him already at the bench with coffee made. She liked the way he passed her tools without her asking when he could see what she needed. She liked that he didn't fill silence unnecessarily, and that when he did speak, it was worth hearing. She was building a life here. She could feel it happening, the way you feel a structure going up one beam, one join, one solid piece at a time. The third night of the storm, something changed. She woke to the sound of him. Not a shout. Reuben wasn't a man who shouted in his sleep. It was lower than that. A sound that started as words and dissolved into something that wasn't language anymore, rough and broken, the sound a person makes when they're fighting something in their chest and losing. She sat up. He was on his back beside her, both arms rigid, his hands gripping the blanket like he was trying to hold on to something. His face in the low firelight was wrong. The stillness he carried in waking hours was completely gone. His jaw was clenched hard enough that she could see the muscle working in his cheek, and his breath was coming in short, shallow bursts that weren't giving him enough air. She put her hand on his arm. "Reuben," she said quietly. He went from still to moving in a single second, and the speed of it startled her. He came upright with both hands forward, and for 2 seconds he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with no cabin and no fire and no Maeve, somewhere dark and years in the past. Then his eyes found her face. He came back slowly. She could see it happening. The return his breathing changed. The set of his shoulders changed. The grip of his hands on the blanket loosened by degrees. "Easy," she said. Same tone she used with a green horse coming off a hard run. Not soft exactly, so it could be condescending, just level, steady, something to anchor to. He sat at the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his head down. His hands were shaking. Not violently, but enough that she could see it in the firelight. She could hear the storm outside, still going, still pushing at the walls. She didn't ask if he was all right. He was clearly not all right, and asking was sometimes just a way of making the person manage your discomfort about their pain. She got up, added wood to the fire, and poured water from the pot on the stove into a mug. She brought it back and set it beside him on the floor, within reach, and sat down on the bed next to him. He picked up the mug after a moment, held it in both hands without drinking. Outside, the wind found a new pitch, and then something cracked in the storm, a tree branch. Most likely, the snap traveling through the cold air, and it hit the night like a rifle shot. Reuben was on his feet before the sound had finished, moving toward the door, moving fast, with the specific directional urgency of a man responding to gunfire. His hand found the coat on the peg. Maeve was up faster. She got between him and the door. When he reached for her to move her aside, she took his arm with both hands and stepped into him, not blocking him, but pressing against him, her chest against his shoulder, her arms going around his back and holding. Her full weight and her full strength applied. She felt the resistance in him, the momentum that wanted to carry him through the door, and out into the storm, toward something that wasn't there anymore, something 5 years gone. "Reuben?" she said, into his shoulder, close and direct. It was a branch. "It's the storm. You're in the cabin." He pushed against her hold. She held. She had the frame for it and the muscle, and she used both without apology. Her father's daughter, her grandfather, the broad Holloway build that had embarrassed Aldous Pemberton's family, she put all of it to work, now standing her ground while Reuben's body tried to answer a threat that existed only in his memory. "You're in the cabin," she said again. "The door's in front of you, the fire's behind you, and it's 20 below outside. You're in the cabin." He pushed once more, hard, and she absorbed it and held. Then he stopped. His breath came out in a long, shuddering exhale. His hands, which had been at her arms trying to move her, went still. A second exhale. Then his head came forward and down, and he was pressing his forehead against her shoulder, and the fight went out of him all at once, like a fire that's run out of material. She kept holding him. His arms came around her slowly. He didn't speak. She didn't either. She just held on, solid and steady, her feet planted, her arms firm, her chin resting on the top of his head, while his breathing worked its way back to something that was giving him enough air. The fire burned. The storm pushed at the windows and didn't find a way in. After a while, she walked him back to the bed. He sat on the edge of it. She sat beside him. He picked up the mug of water from the floor, and this time he drank it. "How long has that been happening?" she said. He took his time. "Since the year after," he said. It went quiet for a while. "Comes back in storms, because it was a winter raid," she said. "They came at night," he said. There was wind. It was loud. He turned the mug in his hands. "The wind covers sounds you need to hear. I knew they were coming, and I wasn't fast enough getting back to the house." She waited. They were already inside. "When I got to the door," he said. His voice was quiet and flat, the flatness of something that's been said before, maybe only in his own head, but said enough times that the words have worn smooth. "My wife's name was Clara. My son was Thomas." "Clara and Thomas." She repeated the names silently. "Let them exist in the room. I got the men off the property," he said. "But not," he stopped. "Not before." He set the mug down on the floor, his hands folded together over his knees. "I've never said their names to anyone here," he said. "People know what happened, but I've never said it." "Why not?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. "Because saying it makes it real in front of another person," he said. "And I didn't trust another person with it." She looked at him, at the scar on his face, at the gray in his hair that was premature by 10 years at least, at the hands folded over his knees, those strong scarred hands that built fires and worked iron and had come out into a blizzard to find a woman he'd never met, because she had a contract and someone needed to. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me with it." He glanced at her sideways. "You didn't give me a lot of choice," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Hard to keep a secret from a woman who just body-checked you away from a door." "I didn't body-check you," she said. "You held me against my own intentions," he said. "That counts. I held you steady," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her then, fully, and his face was open in a way she didn't often see on him. "Yes," he said, "there is." They sat side by side on the edge of the bed in the firelight, she said, because it was her turn, and he'd given her something real, so she owed him something real. In return, the night Aldos's mother sent the letter, I was in the shop trying to finish a commission. Custom saddle, 3 months of work. I'd promised it by the end of the week, and I was behind. She looked at the fire. The letter came by messenger. Very formal, very correct, explaining that Aldous had reconsidered the engagement and that his family felt I was unsuitable for the role of their son's wife. It used the word unsuitable 4 times in 3 paragraphs. Reuben didn't say anything. "I finished the saddle," she said, "that night. I sat in my father's shop and I finished the commission because I'd promised it, and the man was coming Friday, and then I packed my tools and I didn't go back. You didn't try to fight it, he said. Fight what? She said. He'd made his choice. His family had made their case. I wasn't going to stand in a drawing room and argue for my own worth to people who'd already decided I didn't have any. She shook her head. You can't make someone see what they've decided not to see. You just have to find the people who see without being persuaded. He was very still beside her. Is that what you did? He said. Find Deadwood Basin? I found a contract, she said. Deadwood Basin was attached to it. And now? She looked at him. Now I think the contract was the smaller part of what I found. The fire settled. A log shifting on the grate with a low sound, sending a brief bloom of sparks up the flue. The storm outside had dropped from a howl to a moan, which meant it was either breaking or changing direction. Either way, the worst of it was passing. I couldn't hold Clara and Thomas back from what happened to them, Reuben said. He said it without build-up, just placed it in the air between them. I spent, with that turning it over, looking for the place where I could have changed it. The angle I missed, he paused. There isn't one. I know that, most days. But at night, in a storm, your body doesn't know what your mind knows, she said. He looked at her. Grief works that way, she said. You can understand a thing completely and still have your hands look for the door. The understanding is in one place, and the reflex is in another, and they don't always speak to each other. He leaned back against the headboard slowly. She did the same, both of them sitting up, side by side, the blanket across their laps. How do you know that? He said. My mother died when I was 19, she said. Fever. Very fast 11 days from healthy to gone. She pulled the blanket up slightly. For 2 years after, every time someone knocked on the door of the shop, I went cold. Not afraid, exactly. Just cold. Because the knock that told me she was sick had been a knock on a door. My body remembered it before my mind got to explain that most knocks on doors are just people at doors. He let out a slow breath. It passed, she said, mostly. Took time, and it took I don't know. It took enough ordinary knocks on ordinary doors that the ordinary one started to outnumber the one bad one. And the bad one? Still there, she said. Just smaller. The ordinary ones grew around it. He turned his head and looked at her. You're a practical woman, he said. I'm my father's daughter, she said. He said grief was like a bad seam in leather. You don't cut it out because you can't always cut it out without ruining the whole piece. You work around it. You let the rest of the leather get strong enough that the seam stops being the main thing. Reuben was quiet for a long time. Then Thomas liked the horses, he said. He was 3, so he wasn't allowed in the stalls alone, but every time I went in, he'd be right behind me. He had this way of putting both hands flat on the horse's side, just standing there like he was feeling it breathe. Maeve listened. Clara used to say he was going to be a horseman, Reuben said. She meant it as a prediction. I think she was right. He didn't say anything else for a while, and she didn't try to fill it. Some things needed the space around them. You let the air hold it, and you sat nearby, and that was what was asked of you. The storm dropped another notch outside. The moaning in the eaves softened. Eventually, Reuben reached over and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that while the fire burned down to reliable coals, and the cold outside lost its argument with the cabin walls. She thought about strength, about what it actually was, as opposed to what people performed when they wanted to look strong. She'd been told her whole life, in one way or another, that her strength was too much, too visible, too physical, too direct, that a woman's strength was supposed to be quiet, ornamental, expressed in patience and deference, and the management of a household, not in broad shoulders, and the ability to drag a 100-pound trunk 2 miles in a blizzard. But what she'd done tonight wasn't about being large. It was about being present, about reading a situation correctly and responding to what was actually needed, not what was comfortable, not what was polite, but what was needed. She'd put her body between Reuben and a door that would have killed him, and it had worked because she'd been paying attention, because she cared what happened to him, because she hadn't looked away. That was the education her father had given her, really, even if he'd framed it in terms of leatherwork. Pay attention to the material. Understand what it needs. Respond to what's actually there, not to what you expected to find. It applied. She was learning to most things. She looked at Reuben's profile in the firelight. He was calmer now. His breathing was even. The rigidity had gone out of his jaw and his shoulders. He was present. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She said it quietly and without ceremony. Just a fact, stated plainly. He turned to look at her. "I know," he said. Outside, the storm was going out in the direction it had come from, leaving behind the particular deep silence of a world under 3 feet of fresh snow. Inside, the fire held steady, the coals thick and orange, giving out the slow, even heat of something that's past its peak and settled into endurance. They talked for another hour. Small things, mostly the petition letter, the work schedule for when the roads opened, whether the eastern-facing window in the harness room needed recalking before the next storm. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that was its own kind of comfort, that said, tomorrow exists, and we're both in it. Around 2 in the morning, she felt him go heavy beside her. Not the sudden drop of someone who'd fought sleep and lost, but the gradual easing of a man who'd finally found it safe to let go. She adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. She stayed awake for another little while, listening to the silence where the storm had been. Clara and Thomas. She held the names gently, the way you hold something fragile, not to keep it, but to make sure it had been properly received. They'd lived. They'd been loved. They'd been a family in this cabin and on this land, and they were gone. And Reuben had stayed and kept working, and kept the fire going, and kept the post running, and none of that was small. She thought about what it cost a person to stay. After loss, after grief, after the kind of night where your hands look for a door that isn't there anymore, to stay and rebuild and keep building. To come out into a blizzard with a lantern because someone had a contract to fulfill and no one had gone to find them. Staying was its own kind of courage. She closed her eyes. In the morning, the sky through the east window was the clear, brutal blue of a Dakota winter day after a storm. The kind of blue that had no softness in it, pure and cold and honest. The road would need to be dug out. The animals needed tending. There was a petition letter moving through the postal system toward a circuit court, and a freight company expecting hard work by Friday, and a man named Sterling somewhere in this town who thought he understood all the variables in his equation. He was wrong about that. He was missing too. Maeve Halloway got up, built the fire, and put the coffee on. The roads opened on a Saturday. 3 days of blue sky and bitter cold packed the snow down hard enough for wagon runners and shod hooves, and by Saturday morning, the main street of Deadwood Basin was moving again freighters, ranch hands, the dry goods delivery from the Eastern Depot, all the ordinary commerce of a frontier town resuming after enforced stillness. The Thanksgiving service was Sunday. Maeve hadn't planned to go. Not because she had anything against giving thanks. She had, in fact, quite a lot to be grateful for. More than she'd have predicted 2 weeks ago, standing in a blizzard with a 100-pound trunk on her shoulder. But because she was practical about social arithmetic. She'd been in Deadwood Basin for less than 3 weeks. The town's opinion of her ranged from cautious to actively hostile. And walking into a church service alongside Reuben Croft, when Sterling's people were actively looking for ammunition, seemed like handing them a loaded weapon. She said as much to Reuben over breakfast Saturday morning. He listened. He drank his coffee. He set the mug down. "If we don't go," he said, "Sterling's man will spend the whole service talking to Vess and Aldridge without anyone to counter it. Half the congregation will hear his version of who you are and what this arrangement is, before they've had a chance to form their own opinion." She looked at him. "And if we do go," she said, "we hand him something to work with in public." "If we go," Reuben said, "we're just 2 people attending a church service. He's the one who has to make something else out of it. He picked up his mug again. Let him do that in front of witnesses. She thought about it. He was right. She knew he was right. Absence was a kind of statement, too, and in this case, it was the wrong one. All right, she said. We go. She spent Saturday afternoon on her appearance in a way she hadn't spent time on it in months. Not to look smaller or softer or more palatable to a congregation that had already decided what it thought, but because she had standards, and she was going to walk into that building as exactly who she was, and who she was deserved to be presented well. She pressed her good wool dress dark green, simply cut, with a square collar and full sleeves that she'd tailored herself to accommodate her shoulders without bunching. She oiled her boots. She braided her hair and pinned it with the 2 bone pins her mother had left her. She cleaned her hands as thoroughly as she could, though the saddle oil had long since worked into the creases of her palms and wouldn't come out entirely, which she'd made her peace with. When she came out of the back room, Reuben was at the table in his good coat, dark wool brushed, with the collar turned up, and he looked at her without saying anything for a moment. Then, "You look formidable," he said. "Good," she said. "That's the intention." He almost smiled. She was learning to read his almost smiles, the slight change at the corner of his mouth that on anyone else would have been a full grin. They walked to the meeting house together. It was a cold, clear morning, the sky the same brutal blue as the days after the storm, the sun low and sharp. Their breath made clouds. The snow on either side of the packed road was pristine, unmarked, and the church at the end of the main street looked small and plain against the sky, as frontier churches always did, practical rather than ornate, a building that knew what it was for. People were already gathering on the steps. Maeve felt the attention before she saw the faces. It moved through the small crowd on the church steps in a wave heads turning. Conversations pausing, that particular shift in a group's energy when something it wasn't expecting has arrived. She'd felt it before. In St. Louis, at trade meetings where she was the only woman in the room, at the Leather Workers Guild Fair, where she'd entered 3 pieces under her own name, and 2 of the judges hadn't believed at first that she'd made them. She looked straight ahead and kept walking. Martha Hayes was on the steps, talking to a woman Maeve didn't recognize. Martha caught her eye and gave a short, direct nod acknowledgement. Nothing warmer than that, but not hostility either. Maeve returned it. The 2 councilmen, Vess and Aldridge, were near the door. She recognized them from descriptions Reuben had given her. Vess was a heavy-set man in a city-cut suit that looked wrong on the frontier, like he'd brought his St. Louis wardrobe with him and never updated it. Aldridge was thinner and quieter, the kind of quiet that came from calculation rather than shyness. They watched Reuben and Maeve come up the steps without speaking. Inside, the meeting house was 2 rows of plain pews, facing a raised platform with a lectern and a wood-burning stove on either side. It held about 60 people. It was close to full. The smell was candle wax and wool, and the particular warm, dusty smell of a space that was heated infrequently and used for important things. Reuben took a seat 3 rows from the front, which she understood was deliberate, visible without being confrontational, present without being aggressive. She sat beside him. The service was ordinary. The pastor, a lean man named Brecht, with a careful, earnest manner, spoke about gratitude in the specific terms of frontier life survival, harvest, community, the particular grace of another winter, begun with a roof overhead and food stored. Maeve listened. She meant it when she bowed her head. She was grateful, genuinely, practically, specifically grateful in ways she hadn't been in a long time. It was after the service that the day changed. They came out onto the steps into the sharp noon light, and Maeve was just buttoning her coat when she heard the voice. "Mr. Croft." It was smooth, professionally smooth, the kind of smooth that came from years of practice at sounding reasonable while saying unreasonable things. She turned. Thaddeus Sterling was about 50, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wanted you to know he'd come from somewhere with better tailors than this. silver-haired at the temples, clean-shaven, with the solid build of a man who'd once done physical work, and now merely carried the memory of it. Beside him were two men she didn't recognize, and Councilman Vess, who was examining his hat brim with great interest. "Sterling," Reuben said, flat, acknowledging without welcoming. Sterling's eyes moved to Maeve. They moved the way Carmichael's had, the same inventory, but with more sophistication. He wasn't trying to categorize her. He was looking for the specific purchase point he'd already decided to use. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Sterling said to her. His tone was cordial, practiced. "Maeve Halloway," she said. "Ah," he said, and the single syllable carried something a performance of mild surprise, as if he hadn't known exactly who she was for the past week. "The leather woman, I've heard about your work." A pause. "I've also heard about your living arrangements." The steps had gone quiet. The people who'd been moving past had slowed. Maeve could feel it, the congregation clustering, the conversations dropping in volume, the instincts of a small community to gather around a confrontation, even when it would rather pretend it hadn't. This was what Sterling wanted. The audience was the point. "My living arrangements are a business matter," Maeve said. "I have a contract with Mr. Croft's staging post." "Of course," Sterling said pleasantly. "A business matter. Although I wonder if the ladies of this congregation share that understanding." He let his eyes move across the women, nearest to them Mrs. Aldridge, two ranchers' wives, Martha Hayes, who was watching with her arms folded, a single woman, unchaperoned, residing at a bachelor's establishment, in a town with a perfectly adequate boarding house available. He tilted his head slightly. One might wonder what kind of business arrangement requires such proximity. The implication sat in the air like smoke. Reuben took one step forward. It was a single step, controlled, but it had weight behind it. Sterling's men straightened almost imperceptibly. "Careful," Reuben said. "Quiet, direct, very careful about what you say next." "I'm merely expressing the community's concern," Sterling said. He spread his hands reasonable, open, performing reasonableness for everyone watching. "No," Reuben said. "You're using a woman's reputation as a lever because you're losing the legal argument, and you know it." He held Sterling's gaze. "Try the argument that has merit and leave her out of it." Sterling smiled. It didn't reach anywhere useful. "The legal argument is proceeding quite naturally, I think. The council has been most cooperative." He glanced at Vess, who was still studying his hat. "And as for leaving the lady out of it, she inserted herself into a property dispute that had nothing to do with her. The community has a right to understand who is involved in matters that affect them all." He took a step toward Maeve, directly then. Just half a step, but deliberate. And Sterling's man on his right, younger, thicker-necked, with the particular bearing of someone hired to be present, rather than to think, reached out and closed his hand around Maeve's upper arm. It happened fast. Reuben hit him. One punch, clean, delivered, with the economy of a man who had grown up doing hard physical work and didn't need to wind up. The man's head snapped back, and he sat down on the church steps with an expression of complete surprise, and the collective exhale from the watching congregation was audible. Sterling stepped back. His other man moved forward. Maeve stepped between them. Not because Reuben needed her to. He was more than capable of handling what was in front of him, but because this was her fight, too. It had been her fight since before she arrived in Deadwood Basin, since Sterling's syndicate put her father's name on a bill of sale and walked away with 40 years of a man's labor for a tenth of its value. She was done being managed around the edges of her own story. She looked at Sterling, at Vess, at the broader arc of the congregation on the steps around them. She turned slightly, so she was speaking to all of them, not just the man in front of her. This frontier wasn't conquered by lace-cuffed parasites counting coins, she said. Her voice came out clear and even, carrying across the steps without effort. Years of projecting her voice across loud workshops had trained it for this without her knowing. It was built by broad backs and calloused hands that bleed into the dirt. She held the paws. My hands. She raised them, turned them palm out. The creases dark with saddle oil, the calluses visible even from a distance. Reuben Croft's hands. Gideon Scott's hands. Every freighter and rancher and storekeeper in this town, whose back has bent under real work, while men like Sterling sit in heated offices and draft papers, telling you what your land is worth. Sterling's expression had changed, still controlled, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected embarrassment, or silence, or a woman, deferring to the men around her. My father built a leather shop in St. Louis for 40 years, she said. Sterling's syndicate bought his building and his shop for a tenth of what it was worth when he was too tired to fight anymore. I watched it happen. I know what these offers look like, and I know what comes after them. She looked at the congregation, at the ranchers' wives, and the freighters, and Martha Hayes with her arms still folded, and now with something different in her face. He will make you feel reasonable for accepting his terms. He will make resistance feel foolish and costly and naive. And then, when you've signed, you'll find out that the reasonable terms have a very specific fine print. She looked back at Sterling. You put your man's hand on me, she said, on the steps of a church, in front of this town. She didn't raise her voice. That's what your confidence looks like when you think you're not being challenged. I want everyone here to remember that. The steps were very quiet. Sterling straightened his coat. His man had gotten up from the steps and moved back to his position, one hand pressed to his jaw, his expression a careful blank. Eloquent? Sterling said. His voice had gone thin, the warmth stripped out. You're a long way from St. Louis, Miss Holloway. I'd remember that. I know exactly how far I am from St. Louis, she said. It's one of the things I'm grateful for. She turned away from him. It was the most deliberate thing she did, turning her back on him. Not because she'd stopped being alert, not because she was naive enough to think the conversation had ended things, but because showing the congregation that he didn't require her continued attention was its own statement. Reuben was beside her. He touched her elbow once, briefly, and they walked down the steps together and into the street. They didn't speak for a block. Then Reuben said, lace-cuffed parasites. It came to me in the moment, she said. It was accurate, he said. She looked sideways at him. His jaw was still tight, the way it got when something was taking effort to manage, but his eyes when they met hers were clear. You all right? She said. I put a man on the ground on church steps. On Thanksgiving Sunday, he said. He put his hand on me. First, she said, I know he did. A pause. I'd do it again. I know you would, she said. They walked another half block in the cold, their boots crunching on the packed snow. What happens now? She said. He escalates, Reuben said. This was a test. He wanted to see how we respond under public pressure. Now he knows. And that's worse, she said. Probably, he said. But the alternative was letting him set the terms of how this town sees you. And I wasn't going to do that. She thought about that, about what it meant that he'd said you rather than us. He'd been thinking about her specifically, about what today's scene might cost her specifically. And he'd stepped in when Sterling's man grabbed her without a moment's calculation about whether it was expedient. That was the thing about Reuben Croft. He didn't negotiate his own principles. You could like what he was or not, but what he was didn't change based on the audience. Behind them, they heard footsteps, quick ones, deliberate, catching up. Martha Hayes came alongside them and fell into step without preamble. That was some speech, she said to Maeve. Maeve glanced at her. It needed saying. It did, Martha said. She was quiet for a moment, her breath coming in white puffs with the speed of her walk. Sterling's been promising the council a rail spur that'll bring commerce to the north end of town. Vess has been telling people its progress. She paused. He hasn't told them what parcel the rail line goes through to get there. Reuben's, Maeve said. Reuben's, Martha confirmed, and the routing they've drawn also clips the edge of the Gideon Scott's freight yard, which they haven't mentioned to Gideon. Reuben had gone still beside her. "Where did you hear that?" he said. "Sterling's surveyor had dinner in my store 3 days ago," Martha said dryly. Men who think a woman running a dry goods counter isn't listening tend to talk freely. She looked at Reuben. "The survey map they're taking to the council meeting next week shows the Scott freight yard boundary 6 yards east of where it actually sits." "Falsified," Maeve said. "As far as I could tell," Martha said. "I'm no surveyor. But I've lived next to that freight yard for 11 years, and I know where the corner post is. And that map put it somewhere it isn't." Gideon Scott. She'd met him twice in her weeks. At the staging post, a broad, quiet man in his 40s, who ran the freight teamster operation out of the yard on the south edge of town. Reuben's most trusted ally, according to everything she'd seen. He'd shaken her hand like it was entirely ordinary, and helped her unload a supply delivery without being asked, and charged Reuben a fair rate for freight connections without the usual negotiation. "We need to tell him," Maeve said. "I know it," Martha said. Reuben was already turning, reorienting his direction toward the south end of town. "Martha," Maeve said. The older woman looked at her. "Thank you," Maeve said, "for telling us. And for this morning." Martha looked at her for a moment, and the expression on her face was complex, not quite warm, not quite apologetic, but somewhere in the territory of both. "I was wrong about you," she said. "When I came to the staging post that first time, I had an idea of what the arrangement was, and it was none of my business, and I should have kept it that way." She paused. "I'm keeping it that way now. What you just told us is very much our business," Maeve said. "Yes," Martha said, "which is why I told you." She nodded once, briskly, and peeled off toward her store. Maeve watched her go. They found Gideon Scott at his freight yard, even on Thanksgiving Sunday, because Gideon Scott was the kind of man who worked when there was work to do. He was in the yard, checking the wheel, bearings on his lead freight wagon when they came through the gate. He straightened when he saw their faces. "What happened?" he said. Reuben told him about the survey map. Short sentences, accurate, no drama. Gideon listened without interrupting, his expression going from attentive to very still. When Reuben finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the yard around him, the wagons, the stalls, the equipment shelters, the scale house by the gate. 11 years of building, in a territory where a black freighter building anything was an act of daily persistence against active resistance. "How sure is Martha?" he said. "Sure enough to come to us on Thanksgiving, son," Reuben said. Gideon nodded slowly. "I have my original deed," he said. "Filed with the Territorial Land Office in '69. Corner post coordinates are registered." "That's what we need," Maeve said. "Can I see it?" He looked at her, and there was nothing in his look that questioned why she was asking. He'd done his own assessing of her in the weeks since she'd arrived. She knew you didn't survive 11 years in a frontier territory as a black freight operator without getting very good at reading people quickly and accurately. Apparently, she'd read adequately. "Come inside," he said. They spent 2 hours at Gideon's table with his deed, and Reuben's deeds, and the notes Maeve had been building since she first looked at Sterling's counter-survey. She spread it all out and cross-referenced it, and what she found was both worse and better than she'd expected. Worse, because the falsification wasn't limited to Gideon's boundary. Sterling's survey had quietly shifted 4 property lines, all of them belonging to working-class owners, all of them adjusted in directions that expanded the railroad's proposed right-of-way. Better, because falsification at that scale left evidence. Real surveys had to correspond to physical markers, corner posts, creek lines, ridge elevations, and when they didn't, the discrepancy was documentable. A federal judge with the right documentation could see it in 20 minutes. "We need all of this in order before the council meets next week," Maeve said. "The council meeting's Wednesday," Reuben said. "Then we have 3 days," she said. She looked at Gideon. "Are you willing to be part of this filing? Your deed strengthens the case considerably." Gideon looked at the papers spread across his table, at his own deed, his corner post coordinates, his 11 years of operating receipts that she'd spread out across the right side of the table to establish the property's commercial use history. "I've been part of this since before Sterling got here," Gideon said. "I just didn't have anyone to put the papers in the right order." He looked at Maeve when he said it. Directly, without elaboration, she understood. She pulled the first sheet toward her. "Let's get started," she said. They worked by lamplight until well past dark, the three of them around Gideon's table, and outside the temperature dropped, and the stars over Deadwood Basin were hard and bright, and the town was quiet with the Sunday evening, quiet of a place that had eaten and prayed and was settling in for the night before Thanksgiving, and they were spending it building a legal case. Maeve's hand cramped around the pen, and she shook it out and kept writing. She thought about Sterling on the church steps, his practiced smile, his man's hand on her arm. She thought about the congregation watching. She thought about what Martha had said, "I was wrong about you." 3 simple words from a woman who hadn't needed to say them, who'd chosen to say them anyway, who'd then followed them up with actionable information. That was what solidarity looked like in practice. Not a speech or a gesture. A woman who changed her mind, showing up on Thanksgiving Sunday with information that mattered. The lamp burned low, and Gideon refilled it. Reuben sat across the table, reading the freight contracts, marking the dates. Maeve wrote. Outside, Deadwood Basin slept under its hard stars, and inside a freight operator's back room, 3 people built the argument that was going to matter when the judge arrived, and none of them were under any illusion that it was going to be easy, and none of them stopped. The council meeting on Wednesday went badly. Not catastrophically, but badly enough. Maeve had known it was possible. She'd laid out the legal argument as cleanly as she could. 3 evenings of work. The documents in order, the falsified survey line documented against the registered corner posts, and Reuben had presented it to the council with the steady directness he brought to everything. Gideon had come and sat in the front row and said nothing, which said everything, because everyone in that room knew what it had cost him to be there, and what it meant that he'd shown up anyway. Vess had listened, or performed listening, which was different. Then he'd tabled the survey dispute for further review, and called a vote on the commercial development designation anyway. 4 votes to 2. The designation passed. It wasn't the end. Maeve knew it wasn't the end. The designation meant nothing if the circuit court ruling superseded it, and they'd filed the petition to move up Judge Vance's circuit date. But the petition was traveling through a postal system in December in Dakota Territory, and Sterling's men had just gotten what they came for at the local level, and the gap between now and the judge's arrival was going to be dangerous. She'd said as much to Reuben on the walk back. He'd agreed. They'd both known this was coming. Knowing it didn't make it easier to sit across from Vess and watch him perform the role of a man deliberating while pocketing someone else's money, but it didn't surprise them either. What came next was always going to be the question. She threw herself into work for the rest of the week. It was what she did when the variables outside her control multiplied. She focused hard on the variables she could manage. She finished Stokes's freight order 2 days ahead of schedule and started in on a backlog of saddle repairs she'd taken on from 2 local ranchers. She had 3 custom collar tree forms roughed out and was doing the finish shaping on the first when Gideon came by the staging post on Friday morning. He came in through the forge side door and stood in the harness room doorway with his hat in his hands and a look on his face she'd learned to read as his version of concerned, which in Gideon's case meant almost no visible change from his usual expression, except a slight compression around the eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said. Reuben came in from the forge behind him, still holding his hammer. "Tell us both," Reuben said. Gideon came in and sat on the stool by the workbench. He turned his hat in his hands once and set it on his knee. "I've been watching the Carmichael's saloon at night," he said. "Since the council meeting, Sterling's men have been running late hours there, 4, sometimes 5 men, different faces than the ones he came in with. Not lawyers. He paused. The kind of men a person hires for a different category of work. Maeve set down the collar form. "How many did you count?" Reuben said. "7, over 3 nights," Gideon said. "Not all at once. They're rotating through, staying at the boarding house under travel names. 7 hired men was not a negotiation. It was not a legal strategy. 7 hired men in a frontier town in December, rotating through a saloon, operating under false names, was a specific kind of preparation for a specific kind of action. He's not waiting for the judge," Maeve said. "He can't," Gideon said. "If Vance gets here and rules on the petition before Sterling moves on the property, the commercial designation is worthless. He needs to create facts on the ground before the legal process catches up." Reuben had gone very still, in the way she recognized not frozen, but the particular stillness of a man who had moved from considering options to eliminating them. He was down to the ones that remained. "We should move the deed box," Maeve said. "Tonight." Both men looked at her. "The original survey deeds and the ancestral land registry," she said. "They're in the tin box in the staging post office. If Sterling's men come for the post, the first thing they'll do is take whatever documentation is in there. We move it somewhere off property." "Martha's store," Gideon said. "She's got a floor safe." "Martha's store," Reuben agreed. "I'll take it tonight," Gideon said, "after dark." "Not alone," Reuben said. "I've been moving freight in this territory for 11 years at night," Gideon said. "I know how to move without being watched." They looked at each other for a moment, the particular wordless exchange of men who trusted each other and had just reached the edge of where that trust had been tested before. "All right," Reuben said. Gideon took the deed box that evening. Maeve watched from the forge side window as he wrapped it in canvas, tucked it under his arm like a freight ledger, and walked out the back gate toward the south end of town in the dark. She watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she went back to work. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the warm bed with Reuben's arm across her waist and the fire burning steady, and she looked at the ceiling and ran probabilities. Sterling had the council vote. He had 7 hired men. He was out of legal runway. The gap between now and the judge's arrival was 3 weeks at minimum, and that was if the postal rider had moved fast and the circuit court clerk hadn't shelved the petition. 3 weeks was a long time. She was still running those numbers when she finally slept. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the attack came. On a Saturday night, the first indication was the wind. It was a record gale. Reuben had said at dinner, watching the sky to the north go dark by 4 in the afternoon, the kind of wind that came off the Dakotan plain in December, like it had a specific grievance, driving the temperature down 20 degrees in 3 hours and turning every sound into a version of every other sound. Hoofbeats became wind. Voices became wind. The creak of the staging post barn became wind. They'd banked the forge fire before bed and done an extra check on the barn animals, both of them moving through the cold with the efficiency of people who'd learned to prepare rather than react. Maeve had brought her completed saddle repair work into the cabin. The leather needed temperature stability overnight, she told Reuben, which was true, and it also meant the most valuable finished work was not in the barn. She hadn't said that part out loud. He'd understood it anyway. They went to bed around 10. She woke to the smell. It was faint at first, the kind of thing you process as a dream before you recognize it as real. Smoke, but not hearth smoke. Hearth smoke had a particular domestic quality that you learned to accept in winter. This was different, sharper, with something underneath it, something acrid and chemical. Lamp oil. She sat up. The window on the north side of the cabin glowed orange. She was out of the bed before she'd consciously decided to move. She crossed to the window in 3 strides and looked out, and what she saw put everything else out of her mind immediately. The staging post barn was on fire. Not smoldering burning, fully and completely, the whole east wall alight, the flames 30 feet high and pushing horizontal in the gale, sending sparks across the roof in cascades. Reuben, she said. He was already up. Then the first shot came. It came through the north window, not through the glass, but past it, close enough that she heard the specific whistle of it and dropped low without thinking. A second shot followed. Both high, warning, or poor aim. She couldn't tell. Get down, Reuben said, and he was already at the rifle pegs above the door, pulling the Winchester down with one hand and checking the load by feel in the dark. The horses, she said. I know, Reuben. The horses are in that barn. I know, Maeve. He said it steady, not dismissing her, just holding the line between panic and action. Stay low. Stay away from the windows. She stayed low. She moved to the far wall where the trunk was and got behind it, which was approximately 60 pounds of iron tools, which was not nothing. She pulled her boots on in the dark by feel. Then her coat. Another shot. This one hit the cabin wall. She heard the wood to take it. A flat, dense impact that was nothing like the crack of the wind. Reuben was at the door. How many can you see? She said. He had the door open 3 inches, looking through the gap. 3 on the north side. There'll be more. From the barn through the roar of the fire and the gale she heard a human voice. One word, maybe a name, and then something that might have been a cough or might have been something worse. Gideon. He'd been there. He'd come back after delivering the deed box. She knew he'd said he had freight to move out of the post's storage bay first thing in the morning, and he'd been planning to bed down in the office rather than walk back to his yard in the record cold. She was at the back door before she'd finished the thought. Maeve. Reuben's voice cracked across the room. Gideon's in there, she said. A pause. 3 seconds. She could hear him calculating fire. Armed men, Gideon. The deed boxer. The back door opens to the blind side of the forge building, he said. You'll have cover for the first 40 feet. After that, you're in the open? I know the layout, she said. Take the... He started. I know, she said. She grabbed the heavy leather apron off the peg by the back door. Not as fire protection leather burned, as insulation for her hands, which she'd need for opening hot latches. She also grabbed the wool blanket off the trunk, threw it around her shoulders. She went out the back door. The cold hit her first. Then the noise, the fire was louder outside. A sustained roaring that ate the wind rather than competing with it. The sky to the north was fully lit, orange-red, the kind of sky that meant a structure fire so complete that it was creating its own weather. She ran along the back of the forge building with her head down, boots breaking through the snow's crust, and came around the south corner. The barn's east wall was gone. The roof was going, but the west side, the side with the main stall doors, was still standing, still structurally intact. The fire not yet having found its way around to it. She heard it again, a voice from inside, coughing, and then a sound that resolved into her name. Maeve. Maeve. She went to the west door and hit the latch with her gloved hand. Iron, and it was already warm, not burning yet, but warm. She used the leather apron folded double, got the latch up, hauled the door open. The smoke rolled out at her. She dropped to her knees, where the air was clearer, and went in. The fire had taken the hayloft and the east wall, and the heat was extraordinary. The kind of heat that convinced her skin it was already burning, even when it wasn't. She could see maybe 8 feet. Everything beyond that was orange-gray opacity. She moved along the west wall, keeping one hand on the boards, calling Gideon. Here. The cough came with the word. Post office. Beam. She found him in the passage between the barn and the staging post office. A roof beam had come down not on him, but angled across the passage in a way that had blocked his exit, and when he'd tried to go back, the fire had cut off the other direction. He was crouched against the wall under the beam, his coat over his face, bleeding from a cut on his forehead where the beam's fall had clipped him. She looked at the beam. It was about 8 inches around, old-growth timber, partially on fire at the far end. She looked at the space between the beam and the floor. 20 inches, maybe. Gideon was a broad man. She wasn't going to tell him he couldn't fit. She was going to make it work. She got beside the beam, found the load point, and pushed. It moved. It was already unbalanced from the fall, resting on 2 points, and she found the physics of it, the way her father had taught her to find the mechanics of any heavy object, not strength alone, but leverage and angle and direction. Get flat, she told Gideon. On your back, arms over your head. He did it, without arguing. She pushed the beam another 4 inches, which was enough, and he came through the gap on his back, pulling with his heels, and she held the beam until he was clear. She let it go and grabbed him by the collar, and they moved out the barn door, into the snow, and the cold air was so much colder than the fire that it felt like falling into water. Gideon got his feet under him on the second step. She kept hold of his coat collar anyway, pulling him to the left, around the south side of the forge building, away from the direction the gunfire had come from. They came around the forge building, and she pulled him into the covered passage between the forge and the staging post proper, which was the most sheltered point on the property, walls on 3 sides, and the forge building's south wall on the 4th. She looked at him. His forehead was bleeding, freely, but not arterially. His eyes were tracking. He was coughing deep and rough, the kind of cough that came from smoke in the lungs, but he was breathing. The deed box, he said between coughs. At Martha's, she said. You got it there. He exhaled. Good. A shot cracked from the north, closer than before. She looked around the corner of the forge building. The barn was fully involved now, the entire structure, and the light it threw was lurid and complete, turning the snow around it orange. She could see the staging post office beyond it, and the office was starting to catch on the north face. Sparks from the barn landing on the old timber roof. She could also see Reuben. He was at the corner of the cabin, rifle up, and he was in a bad position. The fire behind him was putting him in silhouette for anyone on the north side of the property. And she could see 2 of Sterling's men moving along the fence line in that orange-lit dark. She needed to tell him to move. He couldn't see what she could see from her angle. She couldn't shout across the yard. It would give her position and Gideon's. She looked around the covered passage. Gideon's freight harness was hanging on the wall, left over from the morning's work. Heavy chain trace on a hook. She took the chain down, found the end with the clevis hook, and threw it. Not at anyone. She threw it across the open yard toward the north fence, where it hit the frozen ground with a sound that carried even over the fire, a metallic crash and clatter that drew both of Sterling's men on the fence line hard to the left toward the sound. Reuben heard it too. He looked toward it, then moved off the cabin corner back into the darkness on the south side. The 2 men on the fence line swept toward the chain sound with their rifles up and found nothing. Gideon had watched her throw the chain. He said nothing, just nodded once. She'd been reacquainting herself with the covered passage, taking inventory of what was in it. Harness on the wall, heavy. A post maul leaning against the forge door, a 12-pound iron head on a hickory handle, the tool they used for driving fence posts. A coil of rope. She picked up the post maul. She was not going to stand in the dark and wait for Sterling's men to come to her. She was not built for waiting, and she'd never pretended otherwise. Passive survival hiding, enduring, outlasting had its place, but not here, not tonight. Not when the building that held Reuben's livelihood was burning and men with rifles were moving through the yard. What she had was the covered passage, the forge building's south wall, the darkness that the fire had not yet reached on this side of the property, and a 12-pound post maul. She also had the layout. 3 weeks of living and working here had given her that. She knew every outbuilding, every fence line, every drift pattern in the snow. She knew that the covered passage ran to a gate on the south end that opened onto the alley behind the staging post, and that alley came around and connected to the main road on the west side. She told Gideon to stay low and stay in the passage. She went out the south gate. The alley was dark, which helped. She moved along it fast, keeping to the fence line, and came around the west side of the property. From this angle, she could see the front of the cabin, the barn, in full flame to the right, and the main road beyond the property gate. And she could see what Reuben hadn't been able to see from his position. There were 5 men total. 2 on the north fence line, the ones she'd drawn off with the chain. 1 on the road in front of the gate, holding horses, which meant he wasn't going to move, and 2 more who'd come around the west side and were moving toward the cabin door. The 2 moving toward the cabin hadn't seen her. She was behind them, to their left, and the fire was in front of them, and the gale was in her favor, coming from the north, which meant her footsteps on the snow were going away from them. She picked her moment. She was 10 feet behind the rearmost man when he stopped and turned, some instinct firing, and she hit him with the flat of the post maul across the back of his knees. He went down hard and fast. The man in front of him spun at the sound, and she'd already stepped to the right, outside his swing, and she brought the maul around level and hit his rifle arm at the elbow. He dropped the rifle in the snow and went down beside it, gripping his arm, and she kicked the rifle further into the snow and kept moving. 2 seconds. 2 men down. She'd been swinging hammers and mauls and heavy tools since she was 12 years old. The mechanics of a post maul were not different from the mechanics of a driving mallet. You put your weight behind it, you used your hips, and you hit what you were aiming at. She came through the gate. Reuben was at the north corner of the cabin. He saw her. His eyes went to the post maul, to the 2 men down behind her, and something moved across his face that resolved into focus. 2 on the fence line north, she said. 1 holding horses on the road. He nodded. He looked toward the fence line, then back at her. Gideon in the passage. He's all right. Beam caught his forehead. He's walking. Another shot from the north fence line. They'd found something to aim at, one of the cabin windows, and Reuben pulled her flat against the cabin wall. They were shoulder to shoulder in the dark, the fire enormous and roaring, 30 feet away, the heat from it reaching them even here. She could see sparks sailing over the cabin roof on the gale, and she could see that the staging post office was fully involved now on the north side, and she could hear the horses in the road screaming at the smell of the smoke. There are too many of them for 2 people, she said. I know, he said. We need to end this fast, she said, before more of that fire finds the property. He looked at her, at the post mall, at the dark stretch of fence line where the 2 remaining men were. I'm going to the roof of the forge, he said. From there I can see the whole north fence line. He paused. What I need is 30 seconds where they're not watching the roof line. She looked at the covered passage gate, at the chain she'd thrown earlier, which was still lying in the open yard, just visible in the firelight. 30 seconds, she said. She went back through the west gate and back into the covered passage. She got the rope coil from the wall. She tied one end to the post maul's handle, and she went to the south gate, and she swung the maul in a wide circle and let it go over the fence toward the north side of the property. It was not a subtle maneuver. The maul hit the frozen ground and bounced and clattered, and the chain she'd thrown earlier tangled with it, and they went across the yard together in a chain and iron crash that sounded like a wagon coming apart on rocky ground. Both men on the north fence line moved toward it. 25 yards away, Reuben went up the south side of the forge building. She heard him barely, over the fire and the gale boots on the wall logs, then the grunt of someone pulling themselves onto a roof. She counted to 30, a rifle report from above, then another. The sounds from the north fence line changed, not 2 men moving toward a noise, but 2 men going down in the snow. Silence on the north fence line. The man on the road with the horses had heard it. She heard him horses, moving, hoofbeats going east on the main road, fast the sound of someone making a decision about self-preservation. Then another shot. This one from the north side of the yard, and it was not from Reuben's position on the forge roof. She heard him make a sound. It was a short sound, involuntary, the kind a body makes when it receives something it didn't expect. And then she heard him come off the roof. Not a controlled descent, not boots on log walls, but the fast, uncontrolled sound of someone falling. She was through the south gate and across the yard before she'd thought about it. He was on the ground on the north side of the forge building. On his back, one hand pressed to his chest, and she could see, even in the terrible orange firelight, that the snow around him was dark. Dark in the specific spreading way that snow gets dark when what's hitting it is warm. She dropped to her knees beside him. Reuben. He was conscious. His eyes found her immediately, which was something. His hand was pressed hard against the left side of his chest, high below the collarbone. Caught one, he said. His voice was controlled, but thin. I see that, she said. She put her hands over his pressing. Hot blood welled through her fingers. How bad does it feel? Bad enough, he said. She looked around the yard. The two men from the fence line were down and not moving. The man on the road was gone. The two she'd put down at the cabin were still down. The barn was gone fully. Nothing to save there. The office was burning. The cabin so far was holding. She and Reuben were alone in the yard, in the snow, in the orange, roaring dark. She needed to get him to town. A doctor. 5 miles of road in the middle of the night in record. Cold with a man who was bleeding from a chest wound. She looked at the covered passage, at the freight harness on the wall, at the rope she'd left there. Her father had built a travois once when a mule broke its leg a mile from the shop. He'd done it with 2 poles and a length of canvas. In about 4 minutes, he'd shown her how. She'd been 14. And she'd helped pull, and she'd never forgotten it, because her father had treated it as an ordinary skill you needed to move something too heavy to carry. So you built what you needed to move it, and you moved it. She was already going for the passage door. Maeve, Reuben said from the snow. His voice was still controlled, which she was grateful for, because she needed him to stay controlled. I'm getting materials, she said. Stay still. Don't use your arms. I know a chest wound, he said. Then you know to stay still, she said. She had the travois built in 6 minutes. 2 of the long fence posts from the south wall, the freight canvas tarpaulin from the passage wall, lashed with a rope at 4 points. It was rough, but it would hold. She'd built it wide. She brought it to him, and she got him onto it. He helped where he could, using his right arm, keeping his left side still. She packed the space around his left side with the wool blanket, folded double, pressing against the wound. This is going to be cold, she said. I'm already cold, he said. 5 miles, she said. I'm going to need you to keep talking. What do you want me to talk about? He said. Whatever you want, she said. She got the travois poles up, 1 under each arm, and she leaned into the first step. The weight was substantial. Reuben was 200 pounds, if he was anything, plus the travois, and the snow was packed hard, but still deep at the edges of the road where she'd have to work. She took the second step, the third. Behind her, the staging post barn burned in the record gale, and sparks sailed over the cabin roof, and the orange sky above Deadwood Basin could be seen. She would later learn, from 3 miles out. She took the next step, and the next, and she didn't look back. Reuben talked. He told her about the first freight contract his father had signed, the terms of it, the rate per mile. His voice was uneven, but present. She matched her pace to it as long as he was talking. She knew what she was working with. The road stretched out in front of her, pale and hard under the stars. She walked. And when she came around the bend that opened onto the first view of Deadwood Basin's lights, a mile in the distance, she saw what she hadn't expected to see yet. Men. On horseback. Coming toward her. With lanterns. She stopped. The lead rider pulled up 10 feet away and held his lantern out. It was Gideon's gotten out. He'd gone for help. Behind him were 6 riders, 2 of the local ranchers. The farrier, the Pastor Brecht, and 2 men she didn't immediately recognize, all of them with lanterns and horses, and in the case of the ranchers, rifles. Gideon looked at the travois, at Reuben, at Maeve, standing at the poles, breathing hard, blood on her hands and her coat. He got down from his horse in one motion. I've got him, he said. She didn't let go of the poles. Right away, she stood there for a moment, because her hands had been holding on for the last mile, and they'd forgotten briefly how to do anything else. Then she let go. Gideon had the travois. Two of the ranchers were beside him. They had a proper litter, rigged between two horses in under 3 minutes. She watched them do it. Watched the efficiency of people who lived in a country where you learned to move an injured man or you lost him. She watched them load Reuben carefully, watched his face, watched his eyes, stay open and find hers. She walked to where his head was. "Still here," she said. His hand found hers cold, weaker than she'd felt it before. "But there, still here," he said. She held his hand and walked beside the litter for the last mile into town, and behind them, Deadwood Basin's sky was orange with the fire that was still burning, and in front of them, the lights of the town were coming up steady and warm, and she walked toward them the same way she'd walked toward every door she'd ever needed to go through. One step, and then the next. They brought Reuben into town at midnight. The dry goods store was the largest ground floor space on the main street, and Martha Hayes had the door open before the horses stopped. She'd heard them coming, or heard Gideon's rider, who'd gone ahead to warn the town, and she'd already moved the center display tables to the walls and put a plank across 2 sawhorses to serve as a surgical table. 2 oil lamps hung from ceiling hooks, and a third stood on the counter, and the light they threw was better than she'd have expected from a store that normally closed at 6. Maeve registered all of this in the 2 seconds it took to come through the door beside the litter. She registered Martha's face, too. The older woman was watching them carry Reuben in, and her expression was doing several things at once. The practical focus of someone who has made decisions and is now executing them, and underneath that, something rawer. She'd seen the fire from town. Everyone had seen the fire from town, and she'd seen Maeve come in behind the litter, blood on her coat and her hands, walking steady, and something in Martha's face shifted at that sight, in a way that wouldn't resolve into a single word. The doctor's name was Abelson, and he was already there, which meant Gideon's rider had gotten to him before the group arrived. He was a compact, gray-bearded man in his 50s who moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had extracted bullets in worse conditions than a dry goods store in December. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at the wound, looked at the wool blanket Maeve had packed against it, and said to the men holding the litter, "Table, careful, on the left side." They got Reuben onto the plank. Maeve moved to stand at his head, out of Abelson's way, but close enough that Reuben could see her face if he opened his eyes. He opened his eyes. "Still here," she said, for the 3rd time tonight. But she'd say it as many times as it needed saying. "Getting repetitive," he said. His voice was thin but dry, which was the most Reuben thing she could imagine him saying at this moment. "Repetition means it's still true," she said. Abelson was cutting the shirt away from the wound, and he looked at Maeve when he did it and said, "You packed this." "On the travois," she said, "about 1.5 miles out, maybe a little more." He looked at the wound, at the packing. "Clean pressure," he said, not to her specifically, more as an observation. Slowed it enough to matter. He reached for his lamp and held it closer and said to the room, "Everyone who isn't helping, step back." The room stepped back. Maeve stayed where she was. Abelson looked at her once, then apparently decided she was helping, and said nothing. Martha came to stand beside Maeve. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, her arms folded, watching the doctor work, and her presence was solid and deliberate. It meant something, and they both knew it. The bullet had gone in high on the left chest, below the collarbone, and Abelson probed the wound with a focus that made Maeve's hands want to do something useful. She kept them still. She watched Reuben's face. His jaw was set, and his eyes were open, and he was looking at the ceiling with the fixed attention of a man managing serious pain by giving it very little room. "Talk to me," she said quietly, "about anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The spring freight rates go up in February. I need to renegotiate the Stokes contract before then." "All right," she said. "What terms?" He talked. slowly and with pauses that were longer than his usual pauses. But he talked. The freight rates and the contract terms and the right-of-way survey he'd commissioned the year before that Sterling's counter-survey had tried to override. He talked, and she listened, and she kept her eyes on his face. And Abelson worked. Around her, the town had filled in. She became aware of it gradually, the sound of the store getting crowded. More footsteps on the plank floor, voices low and then lower. The quality of the room changing as more people came in from the cold. She didn't turn to look. She kept her attention on Reuben. Abelson said, "I have it." He said it, the way doctors say it in the middle of something difficult, calm and informational. And then there was the small metallic sound of a bullet being dropped into a tin dish, and Reuben exhaled a long breath that had more than air in it. "Still with us," Abelson said. "Still with you," Reuben confirmed. Maeve let out a breath of her own. Abelson irrigated the wound, packed it, and began suturing. He worked neatly and fast, and when he finished he pressed a clean linen pad over the closure and said to Maeve, "Hold this, firm pressure. Don't shift it." She held it. He wrapped the bandaging around Reuben's chest and shoulder and tied it off, and then he straightened and looked at the room over Reuben's body. And Maeve turned to look at the room too. It was full. Every person who'd ridden out with Gideon was there. The pastor, the farrier, the two ranchers she'd seen before, and a third she hadn't. Martha's neighbor, a seamstress named Carla, stood near the window, with her coat still on, having come straight from her house. Councilman Aldridge, not Vess. But Aldridge was near the door with an expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he didn't particularly enjoy. And in the back of the room, half visible behind the ranchers, were the faces of people she didn't know. People who had seen the fire and come toward it, instead of away from it, because that was what human beings did. Sometimes, when things were bad enough, they moved toward the thing, rather than away from it, and standing in the same direction as the trouble was a kind of statement, even if they hadn't planned to make one. They had all seen her come in. Not just come in behind the litter. They'd seen her come in with blood on her coat and her hands, and the wool blanket thrown across her shoulders like a cape, walking straight, breathing hard, still holding the travois poles in a grip she hadn't fully released yet. Gideon had told some of them on the road what he'd seen when he reached her. The travois, the mile and a half she'd already covered alone. She could see it in their faces. The specific recalibration of people who have built a picture of someone from second-hand information and then encountered the actual person at a moment when the difference was undeniable. Carmichael was there. He was at the back near the door, and when her eyes found his, he looked at the floor. Not afraid exactly. More like a man who has recently been made to feel the specific discomfort of his own pettiness, brought into view, next to something large. Martha Hayes turned to face the room. "We need water-boiled and clean linen for the morning," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had been running a store in a frontier town for 20 years, and had long ago made her peace with the fact that, if she didn't organize things, they didn't get organized. "I need 2 people to stay in this store tonight and take shifts sitting with him. I need the rest of you to go to your homes and come back in the morning with whatever food you can spare for the household." She paused. "This town burned a man's property tonight on the orders of a railroad syndicate that has been lying to your council for 2 months, she said. "We can deal with the details of that in the morning. Tonight we take care of our own." Nobody argued. Carla the seamstress volunteered for the first watch shift. One of the ranchers, a broad man named Ike Ferris, whom Maeve had seen twice at the staging post, and who had never said more than 4 words to her at a time, said he'd take the second shift and would bring his wife's elk stew at sunup. Aldridge came forward. He stopped in front of Maeve. He had the specific discomfort of a man about to say something he should have said before. "Miss Halloway," he said. She waited. "I want you to know," he said, "that I will be calling for a formal inquiry into the council vote, on the grounds that the development designation was obtained under false pretenses." He paused. I believed Sterling's presentation. I should have done more verification before I voted. She looked at him. He was not a bad man, she thought. He was a weak one, which was a different problem. Bad men knew what they were doing. Weak ones just needed the wind to change. The wind had changed. The inquiry is the right step, she said. And you should know that Rubin's petition to the circuit court is already in the postal system. Judge Vance needs to know about tonight's attack as well. That's an attempted murder charge, layered on top of the property fraud. Aldridge nodded. He looked at Rubin on the makeshift table, at the bandaging, at the doctor packing his instruments. I'll write to the court myself, Aldridge said. Tonight, if you think it helps. It helps, she said. He moved away to find paper, and Martha appeared at Maeve's shoulder. Come to the back, she said. Come wash your hands and sit down for a minute. I'm fine, Maeve said. I know you are, Martha said. Sit down. Anyway, there was something in the way she said it, not an order, not exactly a request. The voice of a woman who had watched another woman carry something heavy for a long time and was offering, plainly, to take some of the weight for a few minutes. Maeve recognized it because her mother had used that voice. She followed Martha to the back room. It was a storage room, shelved on 3 walls with dry goods and canned stores. A small stove in the corner that Martha had going. There was a stool and a crate, and a wash basin with water that was still warm. Maeve sat on the stool and put her hands in the basin and watched the water go pink. Martha handed her a towel. He's going to live, Martha said. She said it without preamble, as a fact rather than a comfort. Abelson is a good doctor, better than he looks, and he doesn't look bad. I know, Maeve said. You brought him 5 miles in record cold on a hand-built travois, Martha said. 1.5 miles, Maeve said. Gideon met me on the road. Still, Martha was quiet for a moment. She stood with her arms folded, looking at the wall above Maeve's head. When I first came to the staging post, she said, when I told you about Sterling's man asking questions. I remember, Maeve said. I was rude to you, Martha said. Before that, when I first saw you there, in my head. She said it with the briskness of someone who has decided to say an uncomfortable thing and is getting it done. I had a fixed idea of what you were, and I fit everything I saw into that idea, and I didn't examine it. Maeve looked at her. What changed it? She said. Tonight, Martha said. Partly. But honestly been watching you for 3 weeks. The way you work. The way you talk to Stokes. And he walked away with a better product than he came for. The way you talked to Gideon, she paused. And the church steps. What you said. What I said made you think differently, Maeve said. What you said reminded me of something I used to know and had let go slack, Martha said. My husband built this store the same way your father built his shop, with his hands and his word and a fair rate. The railroad ran its first survey line through the edge of our property in 1871, and I fought it for 2 years, and I won. She unfolded her arms, and then I got tired, and I stopped paying attention. And when Sterling came here, I heard the words economic development, and I sat on my hands. She looked at Maeve. You reminded me what I'm supposed to be doing, she said. With everything I said, I believed. Another pause, so. I'm sorry for how I thought about you when you first arrived, and I'm grateful for the reminder. And I'm going to go run my store, like a woman who's paying attention from here on. Maeve sat with that for a moment. The honesty of it. The specific, unadorned honesty of a woman naming her own error without excusing it. I'll take that, Maeve said. Thank you. Martha nodded once. There's bread in the tin on the second shelf and salt pork in the crock below it. Eat something before you go back out there. She left the back room. Maeve ate the bread. She hadn't realized she was hungry until she started eating. And then she was very hungry, and she ate the bread and some of the salt pork and drank water from the ladle, and she sat on the stool for 5 minutes and let herself be still. She thought about the travois. She'd built it in the dark, in the snow, by firelight from a burning barn, with a man bleeding in the snow 10 feet away, and 3 of Sterling's men down in the yard around her, and 2 more somewhere on the property. She'd built it because it was what the situation required, and she had the materials and she knew how to do it. And there wasn't a better option. She hadn't thought about her size or her strength as separate things, as things to be aware of, or grateful for, or conscious of. She'd thought about the leverage point on the beam over Gideon's head. She'd thought about the load distribution on the travois poles. She'd thought about the physics of moving a 200-pound man across packed snow without aggravating a chest wound. Her body was a tool, the same as her hands were tools, the same as her skiving knife or her bone folder. You maintained it. You understood its capacity. You put it to work when work was needed. That was all it had ever needed to be. She went back out to Reuben. He was still on the plank table, which they'd moved against the east wall, and padded with folded blankets. His color was better than it had been, on the road, which was something. The store had cleared out to the night watch volunteers. Carla sitting in a chair 3 feet away, with her knitting, and Gideon, who hadn't gone anywhere. Gideon was sitting on a crate near the door, with his coat on. A bandage wrapped around his forehead, where Maeve had cleaned the cut on the road, and Abelson had properly dressed it in the store. His hands were folded on his knees, and he was watching Reuben with the patient, measured attention of a man keeping vigil. He looked up when Maeve came in. She sat down on the floor beside the table and leaned her back against it. From here she could reach up and put her hand over Reuben's, which she did. Gideon said, "The deed box is in Martha's floor safe." "I know," she said. "You told me. I'm telling you again," he said. "In case tonight made it seem like we lost something. We didn't lose anything that matters." She looked at him. His forehead was bandaged. His coat was scorched at the left shoulder, and he'd walked out of a burning barn and then ridden 5 miles into a record gale to get help, and had arrived at exactly the right moment on the road. "How's your head?" she said. "Attached," he said, which is the relevant part. She almost smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for going for help. You were bringing him in already," he said. "I just got the doors open faster." "That's not a small thing," she said. He accepted that with a nod. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way 2 people sit who have been through something together and don't need to process it out loud yet. Reuben's hand under hers was warm. His breathing was even and deeper than it had been on the road. Sleep, Abelson had said, was the best thing for him now. Let the body do what it knew to do. Around 2 in the morning, Reuben opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, orienting. Then he turned his head and found Maeve. "The barn," he said. "Gone," she said. "The cabin's standing. The office is damaged on the north face, but the structure held." He was quiet. "The horses," he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm sorry. I don't know." He looked at the ceiling again. She felt his hand tighten slightly under hers. There was grief in that tightening, real and specific, not for property, not for the financial loss, but for the animals. She knew him well enough by now to know the difference. "Gideon?" he said. "Right here," Gideon said from across the room. Reuben turned his head. He looked at Gideon's bandaged forehead, at the scorched coat. He didn't ask what happened. He could see what happened. "Thank you for coming out for help," Reuben said. "Maeve had you in hand," Gideon said. "I just ran." "Running was correct," Reuben said. "I thought so," Gideon said. They looked at each other for a moment, 2 men who had been friends and allies for years, and did not use many words to describe it, because they didn't need to. Reuben looked back at Maeve. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "All of it. From when I went down," she told him. She described the travois, the 2 men at the cabin west side, the chain throw, and the post mall, the positions of Sterling's remaining men, what she'd been able to see from the alley angle, that he hadn't been able to see from the cabin corner. She told it clearly, in order, the way you report an operation. She'd learned that from her father, too, after a hard job. You accounted for it fully and honestly, because that was how you learned what to do differently and what to repeat. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The post mall," he said. It was the right tool for the situation, she said. It was, he said. And then, how far did you get on the travois before Gideon met you? Mile and a half, she said. Roughly. He looked at her. His eyes, in the lamplight, were steady and direct. And there was something in them she'd seen before, not just the love that had been building between them for weeks, but the specific respect of a person who has seen what another person is capable of and received it fully. I knew what you were, he said, when I found you in the tree line. You knew I was stubborn, she said. I knew you were the kind of person who drags a 100-pound trunk 2 miles in a blizzard, he said. I thought, whoever this is, she doesn't need rescuing. She needs a door opened. You opened several, she said. You walked through them yourself, he said. Everyone. She sat with that. Outside, the night had gone very quiet. The gale had dropped in the hours, since the fire gales like that burned themselves out eventually. Same as everything else, and the silence it left behind was the deep particular silence of a Dakota winter night, when the weather had done what it meant to do and moved on. Gideon fell asleep on his crate around 3, head tipped back against the wall, breathing steady. Carla's knitting needles slowed and stopped. The store was warm and still. Maeve sat on the floor with her back against the table and her hand over Reuben's, and she looked at the lamplight on the ceiling. At first light, Deadwood Basin started coming back. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet accumulation of people arriving at a door with things in their hands. Ike Ferris came at 6 with the elk stew he'd promised, and his wife came with him carrying cornbread and a spare wool blanket. The farrier brought firewood stacked in neat lengths by the store's back door without being asked. 2 of the ranchers' wives came together with a crate of preserved goods jarred, venison-dried beans, saltfish, and set it on Martha's counter without ceremony. Carmichael came at 7. He came alone, without his usual performed authority, just a man in a coat carrying a covered pot that turned out to be bean soup. He set it on the counter. He looked at Maeve, who had just stood up from the floor and was stretching the stiffness out of her back. He opened his mouth. She waited. The room's available, he said. At the boarding house. If you need somewhere to stay while the cabins... He stopped. Started again. It's available. No charge. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, which cost him something. She could see that. I'll let you know, she said. He nodded and left. Martha, who had appeared in the doorway of the back room, with a coffee pot in her hand, watched him go. Then she looked at Maeve with an expression that said several things efficiently. Don't be too easy on him, she said. I wasn't, Maeve said. Good. Martha poured coffee. But don't be too hard either. A man who comes back is worth more than a man who never left. Maeve took the coffee. Abelson arrived at 8 for his morning check and pronounced Reuben's condition stable and improving, which was the most professional way of saying he was going to be all right. He changed the dressing, checked the suture line, and told Reuben he was not to use his left arm for anything for 3 weeks. 2 weeks, Reuben said. 3, Abelson said. I have a staging post to rebuild, Reuben said. You have a staging post site, Abelson said. The rebuilding waits 3 weeks. Or I'm not responsible for what happens to that suture line. You can direct from a distance. Reuben looked at Maeve. Don't look at me, she said. He's the doctor. Reuben looked at the ceiling. 3 weeks, he said, with the tone of a man accepting terms under protest. 3 weeks, Abelson confirmed, and closed his bag. By mid-morning, the store had become something. Maeve didn't have a word for it first, and then found one. A community. Not in the loose, general sense that any group of people living near each other was a community, but in the specific, earned sense of people who had chosen each other in the middle of something hard. Ike Ferris and another rancher named Cole sat with Reuben and talked through what would be needed for the rebuild: timber, labor, hardware, the sequence of work. They spoke to him as a colleague, which he was, and as a neighbor, which he also was, and the conversation had the practical warmth of people who had made a decision to be useful and were being useful. Gideon, awake and clear-headed after a few hours of sleep, sat with Maeve at Martha's counter with the ledger from the staging post's office. She'd grabbed it from the document box before the fire reached the north wall and began working through what could be salvaged and what needed rebuilding from scratch. Martha moved through her store, doing what she always did, running her business, but with the store's door propped open and a steady traffic of people moving through it all morning. And she spoke to all of them, and she fed those who needed feeding. And she was, Maeve thought, exactly what a person was when they'd remembered what they were supposed to be. Around noon, Aldridge came in. He found Maeve at the counter, and he stood across from her and said, "I sent the letter to the court this morning, and I've contacted the other two council members who didn't vote for the designation. We're calling for a public session to formally rescind the vote." Maeve looked at him. "Sterling's people are still in town," she said. "3 of the men from last night are still in custody. Ferris and Cole are holding them at the livery. The other 4 appear to have left the territory." "I know," Aldridge said. "I've sent a rider to the territorial marshal's office. The circuit court petition is the priority," she said. "Everything else depends on the judge getting here." "I understand that now," he said. He looked slightly diminished, the specific diminishment of a man who has understood something too late to prevent the damage. But he was here, doing the next right thing, which was what was asked of him now. "Then let's focus on the judge," she said. She pulled the ledger toward her and picked up her pen. She had work to do. There would be a court case, and she was going to be ready for it. And Reuben was going to recover, and Sterling was going to face a federal judge. And the deed box was in Martha's floor, safe, and the ancestral land survey was intact, and the legal argument was solid. None of that had changed, because someone had tried to burn it down. That was the thing about building something worth keeping. You built it in the documents and in the deeds and in the legal record, where fire couldn't reach it. And you also built it in the people, in the relationships, in the kind of trust that got a man to ride out in a record gale in the middle of the night with a lantern because someone he respected needed help. Sterling had hired men and money and influence and lawyers. He didn't have any of what was in this room. She wrote, "The 4 remaining mercenaries came back on a Tuesday." Maeve had expected it. Not because she had specific intelligence. The territorial marshal's rider hadn't returned yet. The circuit court petition was still traveling, and Sterling himself had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate rather than defeated, but because she understood the logic of desperate men working on a deadline. Sterling had failed to destroy the documentation. He had 3 of his hired hands in custody at the livery stable and 4 more in the wind. His counsel advantage had collapsed when Aldridge called for the public rescission session. His legal footing, already thin, was getting thinner. Every day Maeve added to the evidentiary record. A man in that position didn't stop. He regrouped. She'd been watching for the signs, and on Monday evening, she found them. Gideon's freight contact, a Métis teamster named Duval, who ran goods between Deadwood Basin and the Eastern Depot, came through late Monday with a delivery and a piece of information he'd collected along the route. 4 riders had been spotted at the old Harcourt trapper's cabin, 12 miles north. They were there as of Sunday morning. They had horses, rifles, and enough supplies for a short stay. Duval told Gideon. Gideon came straight to Martha's store, where Reuben had been moved to the back room 3 days after the fire, when Martha had declared the surgical setup dismantled and her store needed to function as a store again. Reuben was sitting up in the back room's spare cot with his left arm immobilized against his chest, and a week's worth of forced stillness making him sharp-edged and difficult. He was considerably more manageable with something real to focus on. Gideon laid it out simply. 4 riders, north cabin, short-term supplies. "They're coming in from the North Road," Reuben said. "That's the only approach from that direction that's passable," Gideon said. "The East Pass is snowed in. The river crossing at Harker's Ford is the only other option, and it's frozen solid." Maeve had been listening from the doorway. She came in now and stood by the cot. Harker's Ford, she said. How wide is the ice at this time of year? Gideon considered. 3 inches, maybe 4 on the edges. The center channel runs fast enough that it doesn't fully freeze until January. Right now, it's bridged at the edges and open in the middle. She looked at Reuben. He looked back at her, and she could see him working through the same geography she was. If they come on the North Road, they enter town from the top of the main street, he said. Open ground, wide approach. They can split and come in on both sides, and there's no natural choke point. But if they detour to the ford, Maeve said. The ford is 50 feet wide at the crossing point, Gideon said. The banks are steep on the east side, 6 feet of ice-cut clay and frozen rock. Maeve had ridden the South River Road twice since the fire, taking deliveries to the 2 ranches on that side of town. She knew the ford. She'd crossed it on the second trip with Ike Ferris's buckboard and felt the ice flex slightly under the wheels and noted the steep east bank with the particular attention she gave to terrain that had tactical value. If riders approach the ford and the east bank is held, she said, they have 3 options. Cross the ice and hope it holds under the horses. Go back north and come around the long way, or dismount. Dismounted men in the open on a frozen river are a different problem than mounted men in a street, Gideon said. Yes, she said, they are. Reuben had gone through the same calculation and arrived at the same place. She could see it in his face. She could also see the particular frustration of a man who had a plan forming and a chest wound that removed him from executing it. Who do we have? He said. They counted. Gideon, able-bodied, Ike Ferris, who'd been at the store every day helping, and whom Maeve had seen handle a rifle with competence when a fox got into his henhouse 2 days prior, and he dealt with it from 30 yards without thinking hard about it. Cole, the other rancher, solid and reliable. The farrier, a man named Dutch Bauer, who was built like the anvil he worked beside, and had told Maeve flatly the morning after the fire that he was available for whatever came next. Pastor Brecht, who surprised her by volunteering immediately, and who turned out, when she asked, to have served 6 years in the Union Army before finding his calling in a different direction. 6 people, plus Maeve. 7, Reuben said. 7, she said. Against 4 on ground, we choose. Those are workable numbers, Gideon said. Those are good numbers, Maeve said. If we use the ground right. She spent Monday night planning. She used the back of one of Gideon's freight ledger pages and drew the ford from memory, the approach road coming in from the north, the ford itself, the east bank with its 6-foot clay face, the south road that ran along the river below the crossing. She marked the sight lines, the distances, the ice thickness she knew versus what she estimated. She marked where horses would hesitate and where they wouldn't, and she marked the 2 points on the east bank where a person could position with a sight line across the full width of the ford. She took it to Reuben at 9 that night. He studied it. He asked 2 questions about the exact angle of the east bank at the north end and about the road surface coming into the approach, and when she answered both, he nodded and said, the north position covers the center ice and the west bank approach. The south position covers the ford exit and the south road. That's what I have, she said. You on the south bank, he said. Gideon takes the north. Gideon has the range with a rifle, she said. South bank is closer work. He looked at her steadily. You're comfortable with that? I'm comfortable with the 10 gauge, she said. At the distances we're talking about on the south bank, it's the right tool. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing what he wanted to say against what he knew about her, and she waited while he worked through it. I know you can do this, he said finally. I want to say be careful, and I know that's not the most useful thing I can say. It's not useless, she said. I'll be careful. Come back, he said. That's a better thing to say, she said, and yes. She kissed him once, brief and certain. Then she picked up the ledger page and went to brief the others. They went to the ford at 4 in the morning. It was coldest then, the hour before first light when the temperature bottomed out, and even the wind seemed frozen in place. They moved quietly, 7 people on horseback through the dark south road, single file, no lanterns. The horse's breath came in small clouds. The snow on the road was packed and silent under the hooves. Maeve rode at the front with Gideon beside her. At the ford, they split without discussion. Gideon and Brecht took the north bank. Ferris and Cole went to the south road position below the crossing. Bauer and the pastor took the east bank's high ground at the center. Maeve took the south end of the east bank, the position with the shortest sight line to the ford exit, and tied her horse to a birch tree 20 yards back from the bank edge. She carried Reuben's 10-gauge double barrel and her own knife, and the loaded pistol she'd borrowed from Gideon's equipment box, and she wore every layer she had. And she stood in the dark on the east bank in the deep cold, and she waited. She was good at waiting, when waiting was the right thing. The sky went from black to dark blue to the early pale gray of a Dakota winter dawn, and the river below her was white and blue-gray, the ice thick at the edges where she stood and thinner toward the center channel, where she could see a dark thread of open water. At 7:30, she heard horses. Not many at once, spread out, the way men moved when they were being careful. She heard the lead horse on the north approach road first, then a pause, then the sound of others closing up behind. She pressed against the east bank. The first rider came to the ford's edge and stopped. He was looking at the ice, assessing it. Behind him, 3 more riders came up and spread along the bank. 4 men total, confirming Duval's count. They were heavily coated against the cold, rifles in scabbards, and they had the watchful, deliberate manner of men who'd been paid to do a job and were now doing it. The lead rider put his horse onto the ice. The horse didn't like it. It stepped with high, uncertain feet, and the rider pushed it forward anyway, which was the mistake. You didn't force a horse onto ice it was telling you was wrong. You listened, pushing. Cost you the horse's judgment, which was the best instrument you had for that kind of terrain. The horse went to the center channel, and the ice held, and she heard the lead rider call back to the others, something brief and encouraging. 2 more riders came onto the ice. The 4th stayed at the west bank, which told her he'd been designated rear security. Smart, from Sterling's planning. But rear security at the bank meant he was alone and separated, and that was going to matter. Maeve looked north along the east bank. She couldn't see Gideon from her position, which meant he couldn't see her, which was correct. They were covering different angles and shouldn't be visible to each other, or they were in the same sight line. She couldn't see Bauer or the pastor either. That was also correct. The 3 riders on the ice were at the center channel. Now the lead horse was stepping carefully around the dark thread of open water, picking its way east, 40 feet from the east bank. 30. She moved to the bank edge. 20 feet. She stood up. Stop, she said. Loud, clear, carrying. You're covered from both banks. Drop the rifles to the ice and put your hands up. The 3 riders on the ice froze. It was the moment that determined everything, the moment between hearing and reacting, when a person either made the rational calculation or the desperate one. She'd seen both, and she didn't know which one was coming. And she held the 10-gauge level, and she waited. From the north bank, Gideon's voice came across the water. North bank is held, he said. South road is held. You've got no approach and no exit. Do what the lady said. The lead rider's head turned north, then south, then back to Maeve on the east bank. The rifle came out of his scabbard slowly. He held it horizontal for a moment, then lowered it to the ice. The sound of it was flat and distinct in the cold air. The second rider did the same. The third didn't. He pulled his horse hard left, away from the east bank, back toward the open water at the center, and he leveled his rifle in Maeve's direction and fired. It went wide. The ice and the horse, moving together, ruined his aim, and the shot went high and to her left, kicking snow off the bank 6 feet from where she stood. She dropped to one knee, which changed her profile and settled her position. She fired the right barrel of the 10-gauge at the ice in front of his horse's hooves. The ice didn't break, it was thick enough at that point to take the shot, but the crack of it and the spray of ice chips was enough. The horse shied hard right, back toward the west bank, and the rider lost his seat and went sideways. He caught himself before he fell, but his rifle hit the ice and slid 4 feet from his reach. "Leave it," Gideon called. "Leave it right there." The rider left it. The fourth man, still at the west bank, had his rifle halfway out of the scabbard when Ferris and Cole came up the south road behind him. She heard Cole's voice, steady and unhurried. "I'd set that back down, friend." The rifle went back. She stood up from her knee on the east bank and looked at the 3 men on the ice. "Walk your horses to the east bank," she said. "Single file, slow. Hands where I can see them." They walked their horses to the east bank. She kept the 10-gauge up until all 3 were off the ice and on the east bank and dismounted. And then Bauer and the pastor came down from the high bank position with rope. She'd thought to put rope in the supply bag, and she was glad of that now, and they started tying hands. The whole action had taken 11 minutes. She cracked the 10-gauge, extracted the spent shell, and reloaded from the shells in her coat pocket. Her hands were very cold but steady, and she did it by feel and by habit. The same way she threaded needles in the dark in the harness room. Gideon came down from the north bank and crossed at the ford's shallow end, picking the solid ice carefully, and came to stand beside her. He looked at the 4 prisoners, at the ice where the rifle had slid, at the crack the 10-gauge shot had made in the bank. "Clean," he said. "No one's hurt," she said. "That was the goal." He nodded. He looked at her in the early gray morning light, this broad woman in layers of wool and canvas, with Reuben's 10-gauge in her hands and ice chips on her coat. And he said, "You know what Reuben's going to say when we tell him?" "He's going to say he wanted to be here," she said. "He's going to say he wanted to be here," Gideon agreed. "And he's going to say you didn't need him." "He was in the plan," she said. "The overwatch position was his. Bauer handled it," Gideon said. "But Reuben's position was built around what he would have done. That counts." She considered that. It was an accurate and generous thing to say, and Gideon was precise with his words, which meant he meant it precisely. "Let's get these men to town," she said. They rode back to Deadwood Basin, with 4 prisoners in a single line between them. Ferris at the front, and Cole at the rear, and Maeve and Gideon on either side. The morning was fully up by the time they reached the main street, pale winter light coming across the rooftops, and the town was awake. It saw them coming. The word moved fast, the way word moved in small towns, where information was the primary currency of the morning. 1 person in a doorway became 2, became a cluster on the boardwalk, became most of the town's main street population, standing in the cold, watching 4 bound men ride in between 7 townspeople who looked like they'd come from somewhere purposeful. Bauer brought the prisoners to the livery, where the first 3 were already held, and Ferris stood guard while Cole rode to fetch Aldridge, who would handle the formal custody paperwork. Maeve dismounted on the main street. Martha was on the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store. She had her coat on and her arms folded, and she was watching with the expression she wore when she'd already formed her assessment and was filing it away. "No injuries," Maeve told her. "Good," Martha said. "Reuben's been awake since 6 asking what that gunshot was." "I'll go tell him," Maeve said. "Maeve." Martha's voice stopped her. She turned. Martha looked at her for a long moment. The main street was full of people watching, which Martha knew and Maeve knew, and Martha said what she said anyway, with the particular composure of a woman who had decided that some things were worth saying in public. "This town owes you an accounting," Martha said. "Not just for today, for all of it. For arriving here and being treated the way you were treated. And doing what you did anyway," she paused. "I'm saying that out loud in the street, so it's on the record." Maeve stood with that for a moment. She looked at the people on the boardwalk. Carmichael, 3 doors down, who had closed a door against her in a blizzard, the 2 councilmen's wives who had watched Sterling work the church steps, and said nothing. The ranchers who had come to Martha's store with elk stew and cornbread and had been showing up every day since. She looked at all of them, and what she saw was not the town that had existed when she arrived. Not entirely. Something had shifted in Deadwood Basin. The way ground shifted in a spring thaw, not all at once, not without resistance, but genuinely and at depth. "You can put it on the record," she said to Martha, "and I'll put this on the record. In return, this town came out with lanterns in the dark. That matters. That's not nothing." Martha nodded. Maeve went inside. Reuben was sitting up on the cot, with the specific posture of a man who has been told to stay still and is complying under protest. His left arm was still immobilized, the bandaging visible at the neck of his shirt. His color was good better every day, and his eyes when she came in were sharp and immediate. "Report," he said. "4 prisoners at the livery," she said. "No injuries on our side. 1 spooked horse and a cracked ice shelf. Sterling's approach from the north is closed." He looked at her steadily. "The ford." "It worked," she said. "Gideon on the north bank, Bauer and Brecht on the high ground, Ferris and Cole on the south road. I held the east bank at the exit." "The gunshot," he said. "One of them didn't want to drop his rifle," she said. "I discouraged him." Reuben was quiet for a moment. "With what?" he said, though she thought he already knew. "Your 10-gauge, she said. "I borrowed it. I put it back in the rack." He sat back against the wall. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at her. "You planned that entire action," he said. "I had the terrain advantage and the information," she said. "The plan followed from those." "Maeve," he said. "Yes." "Come here," he said. She crossed to the cot and sat beside him, and his right arm came around her shoulders, and he pulled her against him carefully, not using his left side, and she leaned into him, and they sat like that for a moment in the quiet back room. "You held the ford," he said. His voice was quiet and close. "We held the ford," she said. 7 people. 7 people you organized and positioned and briefed," he said, "in the dark, in December, against men with rifles." A pause. "My father used to say that the most important skill on the frontier was reading the ground before you needed it. Your father was right," she said. "He was," Reuben said. "You read it." She sat with his arm around her, and the back room was warm. And outside she could hear the main street of Deadwood Basin going about its Tuesday morning, and she let herself feel the tiredness she'd been holding at arm's length since 4 in the morning when they'd ridden out in the dark. It was a clean tiredness, the kind that came from having done a difficult thing well. "When does Vance get here?" Reuben said. "The petition asked for emergency adjudication," she said. "Aldridge's letter went out the same day. If both arrived, and the clerk processed them immediately," she calculated. "Could be as early as next week." "Sterling will know the mercenaries are in custody," Reuben said. "He'll know his options have run out." "Good," she said. "Let him sit with that." "He might run," Reuben said. "He might," she said. "But the fraud charges travel with him. And Aldridge has the council rescission and the formal complaint filed. Sterling runs or he stays. Either way, he faces the judge." Reuben was quiet. "You built a case that follows him," he said. "That's the point of a legal case," she said. "It doesn't depend on geography." She felt him exhale, a long, slow breath against her hair. "3 more weeks on this cot," he said. 2.5, she said. "Abelson said 3 weeks from the night of the fire, and it's been 4 days. 2 weeks and 3 days, he said. "Better," she said. "Can I at least look at the deed box?" he said. "Martha brought it back from the safe yesterday. I want to look at the survey maps." "You can look at the survey maps," she said. "You can read documents. You cannot lift anything heavier than a pen, and you cannot—" "I know what I cannot do," he said. "Then you know the limits," she said. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. A short, dry sound, but present. She felt it more than heard it. "Get me the deed box," he said. She got him the deed box. He spread the survey maps across his lap with his right hand and studied them. And she sat beside him, and they talked through the legal argument in detail, not for the first time, but more specifically than before, now that the threat had been contained and the court was coming. She told him every element she was planning to present, walked him through the evidence sequence, the counter-arguments Sterling's lawyers would likely use, and the documented responses to each. He listened. He asked precise questions. He pointed to 2 places in the survey comparison where she could sharpen the presentation by citing the specific federal statute rather than the general legal principle. And he was right about both. He knew his land. He knew the law that protected it, or should protect it, better than she'd expected. She'd known he was smart. She was still finding new rooms in it. "You're good at this," he said, watching her mark the statute references. "I had a good teacher," she said. "My father's contract lawyer was a woman named Abigail Cross. She let me sit in on 6 weeks of work when I was 22, she said. Maeve paused, remembering it. She said that the law was just an argument, and an argument was just organized thinking, and there was no reason a person with calloused hands couldn't think as clearly as a person with soft ones. Reuben looked at her hands. The pen in them, the calluses. "She was right," he said. "She was right," Maeve said. Outside, a rider came fast down the main street, and she heard hoofbeats, and then voices, and then Gideon's voice among them. And she looked up from the survey map. She heard the word judge. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. Gideon appeared in the doorway of the back room. 30 seconds later, his coat on and his hat in his hand. "Ryder just came in from the East Road," he said. "Circuit Court dispatch. Judge Vance is 2 days out." The room went very still. 2 days, Maeve looked at Reuben. He looked at her. His face was doing several things relief, and something more complicated than relief. The specific emotion of a man who has been defending something for years and can finally see the point where the defense becomes something else. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he confirmed. She sat back down beside him. She picked up the pen. She looked at the survey map, at the documented evidence, at the sequence she'd built across weeks of work by lamplight and firelight, and the lamp in Martha's back room. "Then we have 2 days to make this perfect," she said. She drew a line on the margin of the page and started writing. Judge Joseph Vance arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the dispatch rider, just as Maeve had calculated. He came in a black coach with a federal seal on the door and a marshal riding alongside. And the whole of Deadwood Basin's Main Street seemed to hold its breath when the wheels stopped in front of the town hall. Vance himself was a compact man in his 60s, white-haired, with the deliberate movements of someone who had been delivering verdicts in hard places for a long time and had no patience left for theater. Maeve watched him from the boardwalk. She'd been up since 4. Not from anxiety, from preparation. She'd laid out every document in sequence the night before. On Martha's counter, the original survey deeds, the registered corner post coordinates, the freight contracts, the falsified counter-survey, Sterling's letters, the freight ledgers she'd grabbed from the fire, Aldridge's formal complaint, the council rescission. She'd cross-referenced everything twice and written a summary argument on 6 clean pages of paper in her steadiest hand. Gideon had watched her work until midnight, and then quietly set a coffee pot beside her elbow without saying anything. That was Gideon. The session opened at 10 in the town hall. It was standing room. Every bench was filled, and people stood along the walls, 3 deep ranchers, freighters, the seamstress Carla, Dutch Bauer, Ike Ferris, the pastor. Martha sat in the front row with her arms folded and her chin up. Reuben sat beside Maeve at the table, on the right side of the hall. His left arm was still bandaged against his chest. He'd dressed in his good coat, same as Thanksgiving Sunday, and he sat straight in the chair and looked at the front of the room with the stillness she knew by now was not passivity. It was patience with a spine in it. Sterling sat at the left table with 2 lawyers. He'd dressed expensively, which in a frontier town hall only made him look more out of place. His face was composed. He'd been doing this long enough to stay composed. Judge Vance set his papers down and looked at the room over his glasses. "This is not a social occasion," he said. His voice was dry and carried without effort. I have a property dispute, a commercial designation challenge, a federal fraud allegation, and 4 men in your livery stable awaiting transfer to territorial custody. We'll take them in order, quietly. Sterling's lead lawyer opened first. He was smooth, experienced, and he made the railroad's case sound like simple civic progress. A routing survey, a voluntary commercial designation, an unfortunate misunderstanding about property lines that could be resolved with fair compensation. Maeve listened to all of it. She'd heard this argument before. Sterling's syndicate had used almost the same language in St. Louis 4 years ago before her father signed the bill of sale. Different town, same words. Progress, fair compensation, misunderstanding. When the lawyer finished, Vance looked at Maeve. Miss Halloway, he said, you filed the supporting petition. I did, Your Honor, she said. She stood. She picked up the first document. She wasn't a lawyer. She knew that, and she said it plainly at the start, which she'd learned from Abigail Cross was always the right opening. You named what you were before your opponent could name it for you and make it a liability. I'm a leather crafter and a contract writer, she said. I know survey law because my father's business ran on it. What I'm going to show you isn't complicated. It's a comparison between what the land records say and what Mr. Sterling's survey says. They don't match. She laid the original survey deed on the judge's table. Then the counter-survey Sterling's lawyers had filed. This deed was registered in 1849, she said, before the Homestead Consolidation Act of 1874. Under that act, any counter-survey filed against a pre-1860 claim requires federal land review before it can alter a registered property line. She set the counter-survey beside the deed. Sterling's counter-survey was filed 3 months ago. There is no record of federal land review because there wasn't one. She heard Sterling's lawyer shift in his chair. On its face, she said, this counter-survey is invalid. The commercial designation voted by the council was based on a document that had no legal standing. She moved to the next set. Gideon's deed, the registered corner post coordinates, Martha's testimony, written and signed about the surveyor's dinner conversation. The falsification isn't limited to the Croft property, she said. 4 property lines were adjusted. All of them belong to working landowners. All of them were moved in the direction that benefits the railroad's proposed right-of-way. She set the comparison pages in front of the judge. Vance looked at them for a long time. He was quiet, and the quiet in the room around him was the quietest Maeve had ever heard a room full of people be. Sterling's lawyer stood and began an objection about jurisdiction. Vance waved one hand, without looking up from the pages, and the lawyer sat back down. The judge looked at Sterling directly. Are you aware, Vance said, that filing a falsified survey with a municipal council for the purpose of obtaining a property designation constitutes federal fraud under the Land Management Act? Sterling's composure held, but only just. My surveyors may have made errors, Sterling said. Errors that we're prepared to address through proper. Your men attempted murder on this property 10 days ago, Vance said. He said it. The way he said everything. Flat, direct like he was reading a weather report. 4 of them are in that livery stable. The other 4 left the territory, which the marshal's office is aware of. He looked at the documents again. This is not a misunderstanding about survey lines. The room breathed. Sterling's lawyer leaned over and said something low and urgent. Sterling listened. His face didn't change, but something behind it did. Something that had been held taut went slack, the way a rope goes when the load drops. It took Vance 40 minutes to work through the evidentiary record. He asked Maeve 2 questions, both precise, both about specific statute citations, and both times she had the answer ready. He asked Gideon 1 question about the corner post coordinates, and Gideon answered it without elaboration. At 11:30, Vance set his pen down. The commercial development designation is rescinded, he said. The counter-survey filed by the Western Pacific Railroad Syndicate is declared invalid pending federal land review, which I am formally initiating today. He looked at Sterling. You are stripped of your authority to act as acquisition director in this territory, pending a federal investigation into the fraud allegations. You will surrender your documents to the marshal before you leave this building. He looked at the marshal beside him. Mr. Sterling will be escorted to Bismarck for arraignment on charges of attempted murder and federal fraud. His lawyers may follow. Sterling stood. His face was controlled. It was the only thing left that was. He looked at Maeve once on his way out. Just looked. She looked back, and she didn't look away first. And then the marshal's hand was on Sterling's arm, and they were moving toward the door. The room erupted. Maeve sat down. Reuben's hand found hers under the table. His grip was firm, his right hand, and she held it, and looked at the survey maps spread across the table in front of her. All those evenings, all that lamplight, the scorched ledger she'd grabbed from the burning office wall, the petition she'd written on a cold Tuesday night, while Reuben slept in the back room, every piece of it laid out in order, doing exactly what she'd built it to do. Gideon caught her eye from the front row and gave a single nod. That was all, and it was enough. Martha was already on her feet, organizing people toward the door. Outside on the steps, in the cold, bright December air, Reuben stood beside her and looked at the main street. The same street she'd dragged her trunk down 6 weeks ago in the dark, with every door closed against her. The railroad still needs a right-of-way, he said. They'll negotiate one now, she said, at a fair rate. With all 4 property owners, he said. With all 4, she said. Together, he looked at her, sideways. You built that too, he said. Not just the case. The coalition. She thought about Gideon at the freight yard, with his 11 years of receipts spread across the table. Martha, arriving on Thanksgiving Sunday with information she didn't have to share. Aldridge writing a letter to the circuit court in the middle of the night. People were already there, she said. I just put the papers in order. He almost smiled. She knew that almost smile. She'd learned to love it. Come on, she said. I have harness work due tomorrow. Spring came late to Deadwood Basin, the way it always did in Dakota, slow and deliberate, the cold releasing its grip 1 degree at a time, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then the road, then the fields. By April, the creek behind the staging post was running fast and clear, and the mud was the deep, honest mud of ground that had been frozen solid for months and was finally letting go. The new barn went up in the first week of March. The whole town came. That was the fact of it, plain and without ceremony. On the first Saturday after the thaw made the ground workable, people showed up at the Croft property at 7 in the morning with tools and lumber and their own hands, and they built. Ike Ferris ran the frame crew. Dutch Bauer handled the ironwork on the barn doors and the stall hardware. Gideon organized the materials delivery, 3 wagons from the Eastern Depot, coordinated with the efficiency of a man who moved freight for a living. Maeve ran the harness room rebuild. She'd designed the new layout herself, drawing it out over 3 evenings at Martha's counter, more workbench space, better tool storage, 2 windows instead of 1, so the morning light came in from the right angle for detailed stitching. Reuben had looked at the drawings and said nothing for a moment, and then said it was better than the original. She'd taken that. The cabin was untouched. The fire hadn't reached it. The office they rebuilt on the south side of the staging post, with a connecting door to the harness room, which had been her idea. 2 workspaces connected. Practical. Reuben was out of his sling by the 3rd week of February, 2 weeks after Abelson had predicted, which Abelson accepted with the expression of a man who had expected it and wasn't going to say so. He came back to the forge slowly, half days at first, then full days, and he didn't push the left side until it was ready, which cost him something she could see in his jaw, but he managed it. He was good at managing things. Sterling's arraignment in Bismarck took 3 weeks, and produced guilty pleas on 2 of the 4 charges, the federal land fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit assault. The attempted murder charge was still moving through the territorial court system, attached to the 4 men from the livery. Vance's federal review of the railroad's right-of-way had produced a negotiated settlement. By late February, the rail line would route 200 yards east of the Croft property line through undisputed public land with fair compensation paid to Gideon and the other affected landowners for the preliminary survey access. Aldridge had delivered that news in person, standing in the staging post office with his hat in his hands, and he'd done it without making a speech, just the facts, delivered clearly. She'd thanked him. She'd meant it. The sign went up on a Saturday in April, when the mud had dried enough to work with, and the afternoon light was coming in at the particular low gold angle of a spring evening in the north. Reuben had commissioned it from the carpenter 2 weeks before, and hadn't told her until the morning of. She stood in the doorway of the harness room when she heard the hammer. The carpenter was at the post above the main entrance, and Reuben was beside him, and when the sign was up he stepped back and looked at it, and then looked at her across the yard. She walked out. She looked up at it. Carved timber, clean lettering sealed against the weather. Croft and Halloway, saddlery and staging. She stood there for a while. Behind her, she could hear Gideon coming through the gate with a load of trace chain she'd ordered from Bismarck. He looked up at the sign when he came through and set the chain down and said, "That's right." That was all he said. That was all it needed. She heard Reuben come up beside her. She didn't turn yet. She just looked at the sign and at the rebuilt barn behind it, and at the harness room window, where the afternoon light was already doing what she'd designed it to do, coming through at the angle that made detailed work possible. "The joint deed's in the office," Reuben said. "When you want to sign it." She turned. He was holding a folded document, the deed, and his eyes, when he looked at her, were direct and steady, same as the first night in the tree line, same as the morning after, same as every morning since. He didn't make a speech. He just held it out. She took it. She opened it and read it, because she always read what she signed, fully and carefully. That was not a habit she would ever break, and it was exactly what it said. A joint deed of ownership for the Croft staging post property. 1/2 to Reuben Croft and 1/2 to Maeve Halloway, registered with the Territorial Land Office. Her name on a deed, her name on land she'd helped hold. "Pen's inside," she said. "I know," he said. They went in together, and she signed it at the desk, and he signed it beside her name, and she blotted it and folded it and put it back in the tin box that had survived the fire in Martha's safe, the box that had stayed intact through everything. Sterling had tried. She put the lid back on. Then she went back outside because the evening was coming in gold and clear, and she wanted to be in it. Reuben followed. They stood on the new timber porch, the one the carpenter had built, with a railing that could hold weight, and in the prairie spread out to the west in the last of the light. The creek was audible, running fast. Somewhere in the distance, one of Ferris's horses was doing something loud and seasonal. Deadwood Basin's main street was visible. From here, the buildings small in the distance, lamplight starting to show in the windows. She thought about the first night. The blizzard. The doors closing one after another. The weight of the trunk on her shoulder. And the snow coming sideways, and the particular determination of a person who refuses to let circumstances be the final word. She'd been so tired that night. Tired in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged until she was in this cabin, with a fire and a bowl of venison stew, and someone who looked at her and didn't do arithmetic. She wasn't tired now. Reuben's arm came around her waist. Not tentative. Just there, solid and warm, the way he did things without announcement, because the action was the statement. He kissed the burn scar on her cheek, the one she'd gotten coming out of the barn with Gideon, a spray of sparks she'd caught on the left side of her face, small but permanent. She'd stopped thinking about it weeks ago. His mouth was warm against it. She leaned into him. "Right here, Maeve," he said quietly. "Where you belong." She looked at the prairie. At the last of the gold going off the snow on the distant hills, at the new sign above the door of the place that was half hers. "Where we stand is one," she said. The creek ran on. The evening settled. The lights of Deadwood Basin came up one by one in the windows, and the prairie went dark around them, slow and immense and indifferent in the way that land was indifferent, the way the blizzard had been indifferent, not cruel, but simply vast. They weren't small against it. They were exactly the right size.